Okay, a very good morning and welcome to the 10th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2026. We've got no apologies this morning, and our first item of business is to agree whether to take item 5 in private and any further consideration of a draft legacy report in private at future meetings. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Our next item of business is the continuation of our series of evidence sessions with different inspectorates and commissioners within our remit. And our aim is to seek out their views on the state of the criminal justice system and the challenges for Session 7, which will then inform our legacy work for our successor committee. So I'm very pleased that we're joined this morning by Sarah Snell, HM Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland, Stephen Sandham, Deputy Chief Inspector of Prisons, and Callum McCarthy, Inspector of Prisons, HM Inspectorate of Prisons for Scotland. So warm welcome to you all, and I refer members to paper number 1, and I intend to allow up to 60 minutes for this session, and can invite Sarah Snell to make some opening remarks.
Thank you for inviting His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons in Scotland to give evidence at the Criminal Justice Committee today. I should like to begin, if I may, by explaining that I'm accompanied today by Stephen Sandham and Callum McCarthy, because it would not be proper to present the key work of HMIPS during Session 6 without acknowledging the key role that both have played during that time, as they will both have retired before Session 7. No one will know better than this committee how challenging things have been in terms of the prison population. As I imagine some of the questions today will focus on the issues, I wanted to start by highlighting some of the progress. The investment in physical infrastructure in Scottish prisons is impressive. Few jurisdictions invest in this area, and well as the much-needed building of the replacement prisons for Inverness and Barlinnie, much of the infrastructure of older Scottish prisons has been entirely replaced, such as at Edinburgh and Glenacle. This has included in-cell telephony, making it easier for people to maintain family contact and request support and assistance privately, such as from our independent prison monitors. The Scottish Prisons Assessment and Review of Outcomes for Women, for obvious reasons called Sparrow, looked at the SPS new model of custody for women. As I am describing progress here, I will cite the innovative strategy and the physical design, whilst flagging that the vision cannot be fully realised without commensurate changes in rules and approaches. The new high-security psychiatric unit for women at the State Hospital means those requiring such treatment do not have to go south of the border or, indeed, remain in prison. The new service for short-sentenced prisoners and those on remand to support their return to community, Upside, has been in operation for a year now. And there is a better staffing and skills mix of NHS prison healthcare teams. It represents a significant success that there have been no major incidents of concerted indiscipline in Scottish prisons and that there has been no big-scale loss of living accommodation. Our key concerns clearly concern overpopulation, which amongst its myriad ills breaches international standards, such as by requiring convicted prisoners to share with remand prisoners. Deaths in custody, which reached record highs in 2024 and included the highest number of completed suicides. Although this number reduced to 51 in 2025, there is still not enough understanding of causes and prevention. Transport problems and cancelled healthcare appointments, which disrupted access to secondary care, attendance at seriously ill family bedsides and funerals, and access to courts, but which have shown improvement. A more complex population being incarcerated with rising needs for support and supervision, increasing numbers of people being held in solitary confinement, and a lack of progression for people serving long and life sentences. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So, very pleasing to hear that there is some positive news, but significant challenges as well. I wonder if I can maybe just open up questions just with regard to monitoring the implementation of recommendations that are made following inspections. So we know there's a great deal of work goes on across inspectorates, not least of all your own one. You spoke about the Sparrow report. We're aware of reports regarding the issues around remand. And so I'm interested in how you're able to monitor the the way in which recommendations, the numerous recommendations from those reports are put into place. Because I know there is some concern that in some ways we know what the challenges are and we know what the recommendations are, but actually delivering on them is a challenge.
Thank you. And Callum will talk in a little more detail about this, as he's very much one of our lead in doing the day-to-day work on following up recommendations. I would start by making a general observation that we get a very prompt response from individual prisons in response to reports that we make, listing the actions that they propose to take against the recommendations, and Callum will talk to you about how we manage that. One of the weaknesses that we think there is in the current approach is that quite often a problem will have several causes and several people who need to engage on the causes, and that has proved a little bit problematic in getting long-term change from the recommendations that we make. So we have just moved to a new approach where we're trying to focus on describing the outcomes that we want to see when we return on an inspection, and then convening a round table to support the people who need to solve a particular problem. The one that's in my head is the one we're working on with Glenocal, which is around complaints, which has been a systemic repeated issue in pretty much every report we've done. And you'll have seen that the Scottish Human Rights Commission also produced a report based on many of our findings to try and have a more kind of concerted and cross-responsible group of people looking at what that might require in order to offer change. But I'll let Callum speak a little bit more to the detail.
So, good morning.
Morning.
So we have a process in place following the publication of our reports where the recommendations are in. We will ask the prison to give us an update on those recommendations after 6 months. So we will ask them to provide evidence if they are wishing to close that recommendation, have met that recommendation, and we will assess that evidence. If it's files or documents where they haven't been able to supply them in the past, then we might be satisfied by the evidence. And between 6 and 12 months, we ask them again. We will go back and say which recommendations, the evidence from those recommendations have been accepted or not. If they want to give us another go at providing that evidence for us. And at the 12-month period, we will look at all the evidence that's submitted again, and then we will close that off until the next inspection. But in between times, we may use our independent prison monitors, because we meet with them shortly after the prison report has been published, to try and organise some sort of way of them ticking off some of the stuff that we need to observe. So some of the more less complex stuff, the basics of monitoring of the prison. So we'll give them tasks to do for us to help us with that. And myself personally, our team will go in to the prison as well, maybe for a day or two, and check more of the more complex stuff and maybe some observational stuff. Mm-hmm. After the 12-month period, we will then call it a day and then move on to looking at the recommendations next time we do an inspection.
Thank you. That's helpful sort of practical overview of the sort of process of monitoring. Do you think, would it be fair to kind of assume that the prison population as it is at the moment is impeding some of the implementation of recommendations that are being made?
That's a really interesting question, and I think inevitably, while one's attention has to be focused somewhat on firefighting, somewhat on making spaces to bring people in from courts as those people are being sent to prison, it does impede one's ability to focus on some of the kind of more difficult recommendations. And I think the examples that I would give are around our thematic reports, where almost inevitably those are things which have to be done at a strategic and headquarters level. And, for example, we published a report on progression in 2024, and there has been a team set around the actions that the SPS is proposing to take to try and resolve some of those problems. But we certainly find that when we ask for updates, we're told, well, we haven't quite got to the part that we thought we would have got to, because our small and limited resource has been taken off to, for example, do short-term releases. So I think there are definitely some there's some halting or some slowness in the ability to respond to certainly the recommendations that we think are important, because of the short-term firefighting nature that's been typical of certainly the situation since I took up office last February.
Thank you. And so my final question is, how do you think the prison population can be reduced?
Well, we're very strongly of the opinion that prison should be absolutely a measure of last resort, and that the people who come to prison should be those who present the greatest risk to the public and who cannot safely be managed by alternatives. We think that many of the recommendations in the Sentencing and Penal Policy Review, which look at the whole journey from early years, obviously, to parole and release for those who've served sentences, as offering some really good solutions. I think the evidence that you have looked at every single alternative for somebody who's in front of you as a sheriff or a sentencer, and genuinely demonstrated where the alternatives are not appropriate, either because they aren't available or because they aren't available in your area, begins to gather a body of data where we can understand where some of the shortfalls might be in some of those alternative sentences. I also think I've been told, again, I'm quite new to the Scottish system, but I'm told that there was an impact assessment done before the reduction or the removal, of the 3/4 release point of the long-term sentences was introduced, and the automatic release is now 6 months for the community. I am fairly sure that some of the long-term, the increase in the long-term population has come as a result of that policy. So for me, future legislation really needs to understand what the impact is of legislation, and then if that legislation goes ahead, there's commensurate plans made to cope with the increase in population, or indeed to think differently about the legislation that's being proposed. So specifically to answer your question, I would look at the people who are of the least risk to public, and try and remove those from incarceration. And I know you'll be talking later to the Biometrics Commissioner, and I know he has some innovative recommendations around potentially the use of biometrics to keep people safe, keep the public safe, which obviously is everybody's major concern, but through alternative measures to sort of traditional incarceration. So several measures, there's no single answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm going to open up now to colleagues, and I'll bring in Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Kabir. Good morning, panel.
Good morning.
Staffing and the officers that are in our prisons. So your recent inspection activity has highlighted that there are considerable pressures on the staff in prisons, and that has an attendant impact on the regimes that are operating. Can you set out for the committee what those staffing challenges are, what pressures that they're facing, and what impact precisely do those staffing pressures have on the operation of prison regimes?
Thank you. So there are a range of reasons why staff may be short in a particular prison, and that might be a recruitment retention issue, it might be a sickness absence issue, and one of the elements that I would point to is directly related to overcrowding, where prisons have been asked to take additional numbers of prisoners, but there's no additional staffing with that. That's not just prison SPS staff, that might also be healthcare staff, prison-based social work staff. For example, Low Moss was asked to take 100 more prisoners. That didn't result in an increased overall staffing level. It resulted in asking staff to do overtime and be paid ex gratia, which, if that's a temporary measure, may be welcome and feasible, but when it's a long-term solution, people are tired, exhausted, no longer want the overtime, just want to work the ordinary hours that they're scheduled to. So there's a range of causes. COVID, I think we know, saw a lot of change in terms of older staff moving on, new staff coming in, and people being not used to the kinds of prison regime routine that had been typical pre-COVID. So some staff have found it very difficult to adjust to a more normal prison regime and have found that quite hard to adjust to, and there's been some attrition. And the, I think, most significant thing that we have seen affecting people's confidence and competence is the sort of ability to be budded, to be mentored, to be looked after when you first join. So we've seen some brand new staff being mentored by staff who perhaps have as little as 6 months themselves in the job. That's rare to be quite that small, but maybe 2 years. Probably the most would be 5 years. So with that just brings a sort of level of learning on the job in a very difficult job that brings significant stresses. And what we have seen on inspection is staff doing their very best, running multiple regimes on a busy hall, on busy flats, rushing to make sure that those held on Rule 95 on the wings get their statutory minimum entitlements, making sure that people get to visits, making sure that people get food, get time in the fresh air. And honestly, we've physically seen some people get to the end of that day, and we've seen that very, very pressured day, and just go, I can't come back in tomorrow. So just that sort of level of exhaustion in some of the places where the staffing is particularly difficult. And as I think you will know, the prison service has responded to that by asking individual prisons to introduce a changed rostering, which has shortened the day for prisoners and puts more resources in the day to try and ease those pressures and to try and, in some cases, even free up staff to do some additional work. We're right at the beginning of that. It hasn't been introduced in all prisons yet. We were recently at a prison where we were seeing it 3 weeks in, and our concerns are on the record as being the things that it potentially takes away from prisoners that are important, like access to family, children, in particular, where later visits are not possible on an evening. Families are faced with the choice of either taking children out of school, which clearly would not be good for the children, or having a shorter visit. So, for example, the choice at Perth is, I don't want my daughter to come over from Glasgow on an evening because she'll have to come out of school early. So I've given up my evening opportunity, and she now comes on a Saturday, but that means instead of having an hour with her, I have 40 minutes with her. I know that's a very specific example, but it's those sorts of things that we are anxious about. We also are anxious that the way in which this shortened day has been created with the staff agreement is for them to do long days. So they will do 12-hour shifts, maybe 4 on the trot, and then they'll have a significant amount of time off. At the moment, again, speaking for the recent prison, the staff were very pro this. They found it very positive, they thought, for their work-life balance. And they were getting home earlier because the day was shorter. We worry that over time, the staff sickness absence the attrition may rise up again because those long shifts are quite demanding. And if you lose somebody off that long shift, you can't then backfill. So you don't have somebody who's doing an early who you can ask to extend into the late shift, or vice versa, somebody who you can ask to come in early. So in the end, actually managing your sickness absence flexibly can become quite difficult. Sorry, that was a very long answer to an important question.
It's a very interesting answer, which I'll follow up on if you don't mind, because you mentioned recruitment and retention in there as well as issues around exhaustion. Do you think that, or have you discovered whether those pressures have an impact on safety within prison, whether of the staff or the prisoners, or the prisoners? And do you have a solution to the recruitment and retention challenges?
I think, again, we see some really good practice in places where governors have recognised the challenges of a new member of staff coming in. So a real attempt to show people the environment. We have it a little bit with our own independent prison monitor volunteers. If you've never been inside a prison, you have no idea how you'll feel once the door closes behind you, the sounds, the sights, the noises, the smells. So making sure that people are aware of the environment that they're signing up to in advance of undergoing expensive and significant training clearly is part of that. Prisons are trying to offer new staff a soft landing, so when they start in the prison they are not live immediately but can buddy up with people, they can watch, they can observe, they can be additional to the minimum shift and sort of feel their way in, which I think is to be welcomed. And some places we inspected in Grampian and commended as good practice the mentoring scheme that they had put in place. Sadly, as we find sometimes when we commend good practice, by the time we go back it's changed, and we know at Grampian it's actually already been scaled back somewhat because the staff resource that was given to the mentoring is now needed for something else. But I think there are ways in which people can be supported to feel more confident, more competent and safer in what is, of course, a very unusual environment.
And the safety point, has there been any impact that you've picked up on safety of staff and prisoners?
I think we were trying to look at the level of incidents of violence. And Stephen, I think, do you have some stats on that?
Well, there's no direct evidence that the overcrowding and the pressures on staff is leading to an increase in violence. In fact, if anything, the current stats for the year to date on the number of prisoner-on-prisoner violent incidents, I think, is less than we've seen in other years. So there's no direct. That's partly, we think, because people are behind their cell for more often. So as a result of the staffing pressures which we've talked about, the overcrowding issues, challenges in managing all that, we know that has resulted in over the duration of the period you're talking about, 21 to 25, 26. People being locked up for longer than we would think desirable. So we have some stats on the average amount of time that people are saying they get out of cell, and it's worryingly little amounts of time out of cell. But the thing about being behind your cell is that in some respects that's safer. You're more likely to be subject to an assault, I think, if you're out and about in free periods of association. So there are. So the answer to your question is there's no direct evidence about an adverse impact on safety.
I'm very grateful. Convener.
Rona Mackay, then Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I wanted to ask you, first of all, about prisoners' needs and sort of the rehabilitation aspect. And, you know, we are aware that the needs of the prison population have changed in the demographic, etc., etc. Are you satisfied that prisons are able to cope with those changing needs in terms of medical issues, mental health, and what effect does that have on sort of general running of the prison in terms of through care for all prisoners? And
I think I almost want to frame the question differently, which is about, and linking to what we said earlier about who should be in prison. So I think prisons are doing an extraordinary amount to understand the changing nature of the people who they are looking after. Again, there's a complete flat on Glenocal which has elderly, infirm, 24-hour social care. And I suppose my question would be, should it be the prisons, with their support from social care and healthcare teams, that are adapting to meet those needs, or are there alternatives for elderly, infirm, prisoners suffering with dementia? And again, one of the recommendations in the Sentencing and Penal Review report was about and they pick the age of 60. Often people talk about 50 in prisons as being an age at which people kind of begin to get the infirmities of older age compared with the community. But actually really looking at those needs and making significant decisions about whether the risk is most appropriately managed in prisons. We know that the health teams are having to constantly readjust their skills mixes because of the nature of the need that is coming in. And again, Stephen will speak a little bit more to this, but the level and the greater understanding of neurodiversity, how that affects criminal behaviour, how that brings people inside the carceral net is improving all the time, and trying to keep abreast of that and understanding the implications of that. And then whilst you're working hard to put your resources into making sure that people are safe, have 3 meals a day, have access to the basic entitlement, potentially that can distract from preparing people for release. I think one of the things that's more of a personal observation than that you will find in our reports, but beginning to prepare for release, particularly for short-term prisoners, it sort of happens towards the end. I know the parole board would say, I'd like long-termers to be thinking about how they prepare for parole right from the outset. It's not currently set up for that to be possible, but I think if there was the capacity to change and engage right from the outset and prepare people for release, some things like life skills, they're only available to people in their last few weeks before they're released because they're a precious commodity and there's some level of prioritisation that's needed. But those are skills that I think it would potentially be valuable for remand prisoners to have, for example, valuable for people who might end up going out on short-term release, but then who wouldn't have had it because that short-term release has come sooner than anticipated. And I think I mentioned Upside, which I think is a very positive service that's become available this year. We don't have the evidence for this yet. And I know that there will be a report on their work, but I think, again, how they were envisaged to operate and support people leaving custody after short-term sentences has been somewhat mitigated by the need to be there for those who are being released on the short-term releases. So it's been a much more kind of there's been much more of a hiatus in the development of the service than I think was anticipated or intended. Sorry, Stephen. Talk about the health zone.
Just to follow up on that one. So there was the Scottish Government published research in 2022 which highlighted that 15% of the prison population had long-term mental health conditions, 17% history of self-harm, and 30% current alcohol use disorders, and 16% anxiety. And 18% depression. And in 2024, the Scottish Prison Service organised a prisoner survey, and actually the results, I think, were probably even more alarming there. So 31% of respondents said they were under the influence of alcohol at the time of their offence, and 32% of prisoners reported being under the influence of drugs at the time of the offence, and 35% said they were still using illegal drugs at some point while in prison. And 46% were reporting a prior diagnosis of depression, 35% anxiety, panic disorders, 21% post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think that highlights the fact that you're dealing with really significant issues. And just finally, there's been some research from the University of Stirling which has looked at prisoners on release and followed them for the 4 years after their release, and that again shows a very high a disproportionate impact on the NHS services. So you were 8 times more likely to be involved in ambulance call-outs if you'd got that were linked to mental health issues, 4 times more likely to get involved in admitted to psychiatric hospitals. The list goes on. I mean, it's really quite alarming. I think that shows the level of difficulty of the complexity of the issues that the Scottish Prison Service is trying to deal with.
Comparatively, I know you won't have exact figures, but how has this changed over the decades? I mean, has it always been the case, or is it much more severe now in those figures?
I think so I don't have figures that would give you a comparison. I think they certainly. I think that shows that in 2022 it was significant. If you look at the 24, the self-referral from the survey suggests, if anything, it's getting more difficult. That's the only survey that I know of that's looked at what happens to people on release and the impact on the health services on release for
interesting.
prisoners, but it seems significant.
That's a good illustration of the challenges that it faced. I'd like to move on, if I can, to the Sparrow report that you mentioned in your opening remarks on the women's custody units. At the recent Women, Families and Justice cross-party group, and I think you were there, Sarah, we had a presentation about them from the researchers who'd done a great piece of work on them over, I'm not sure how long, months, maybe a year. I mean, I'll be honest, I was really surprised and disappointed when I saw that presentation, because I think we were all extremely excited about this was a visionary way of dealing with women leaving prison. And there were significant problems, which I think you said in your opening remarks, to do with the rules and process. I wonder if you could just expand for the rest of the committee on roughly the findings of that report. And I mean, my thoughts when I was listening to it was this sort of lack of preparedness from the Scottish Prison Service about how they should be run. Facilities are great, but it was the actual running of them that seemed to be the problem that hadn't been worked out properly. Maybe you could expand a wee bit on that.
I think, again, so we have conducted 2 inspections. So Stirling sort of owns Bella and Lilias, if you like. So Stirling, the Governor of Stirling, is responsible, and then unit managers are the sort of day-to-day operators within Bella and Lilias. We conducted an inspection very soon after they had been opened, so we don't have evidence from inspections about the units. We do have regular independent prison monitoring input, and in terms of kind of human rights concerns, there aren't any, but in terms of vision versus delivery, one of the things that clearly is very disappointing is how hard it has been to encourage women to think of this as a positive move. So it's very difficult to actually keep them full, which when you've got a prison estate which is massively overburdened in so many areas, to have some estate standing empty is a waste. And the other thing that the report flagged was that whilst it was probably initially very much seen as a progression opportunity for longer term and life sentence women, in fact, more recently it's had more of a 70% use by short-term women, which has brought its own complexities. I think there was an intention that the units would sort of grow, opening them and sort of having people experiencing that much more freer engagement, much less oppressive kind of physical infrastructure, would then sort of grow the units, and there'd be an element of co-creation where the women themselves would determine how things should be. I think that, again, the report saw that a significant number of the original staff who'd been trauma-informed, trained, bought into the vision and the concept, had moved on, and then the new staff were perhaps not quite so handpicked and trained quite so well, and brought with them a much more sort of I'm a prison officer, I follow the prison rules, this is a prison like any other. So I think the importance of not just having a vision, but having long-term investment and leadership of that programme is critical. And certainly, and again, my personal desire would be to have a new model of custody for young men in the same way that we have a new model of custody for women, but I think there needs to be much more embedding of the concept and an exploration of various issues, such as whether or not it's possible to allow community access somewhat more speedily for the longer term prisoners, because that's the whole point about this. But again, that involves potentially legislative change. It involves equality between men and women who are held in the Scottish Prison Service. So they're not easy issues. I think the report is incredibly helpful, but what it will also take is obviously significant leadership and direction from the Scottish Prison Service.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, some of the things that came out in the report was, tension between prison staff and women. the wearing of prison uniforms didn't help in that situation. I don't think any of us envisaged that there'd be prison, staff wearing their uniforms. There was short-term women and long-term women clashing, not as much community access, if any. And also, one of the points was that it would have been a family-friendly integration place, so that that could be worked on before the women were released. And we heard that women didn't even want to invite their family there because it just looked like a small prison. And I thought that was incredibly disappointing, because we had a tour of them, and it was a great new vision. We were all fully, well, I know we're supportive of the concept, but it seemed to me that it was rules and lack of leadership that kind of spoiled it. And I'm just wondering, is there a way back from that? I mean, can they still be of use? And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think, like I said in my opening statement, I think it's one of the things that Scotland has done incredibly well. Had the vision, put the investment in, had the courage to try and offer trauma-informed care in an environment which is a more trauma-informed physical environment. And I'm not going to say trauma-informed because it's incredibly difficult to create a prison which is trauma-informed. But I certainly wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't despair. I would use the Sparrow report to understand what's worked well and what's perhaps worked less well, but also then to sort of have a bit of a reset, to have the focus and attention on that area. Women, as you know, as a member of that cross party, there's such a small proportion of the population that's not usually where the policies and procedures are predicated. They end up sort of having policies and procedures which are kind of for the lowest common denominator rather than gender specific. And I think, a real look systemically about what might be able to be done differently, both for women versus men within Scottish prisons, but preferably not within Scottish prisons, but in community provision, but then also understanding where, for example, risk to the public and risk of being in the community might actually encourage a more significant engagement. The story I had on my visit there was an extraordinary one of a life sentence prisoner who patiently, just at the point I was there, had finally got her access to family, to home visits, and she'd been going one day a week to the local church. At the point at which her home leave kicked in, she was no longer allowed to go to the church because she'd had her home leave. And she was like, but that's the community link that I've built up. It's
yeah.
like,
So that's an example
rules,
of bureaucracy that's got in the way. And I mean, that doesn't cost anything to fix. It's just surely changing the practice of how it's operated. Anyway, I'll thank you for that.
don't give up hope, I would say, Rona.
Thank you very much. Interesting to hear some feedback on the report. It certainly was a really interesting presentation at the cross-party group. Okay, Sharon Dowie, followed by Katie Clark.
Good morning. The first question was, how sustainable are the current prison population levels?
They aren't. I mean, obviously, I look at the numbers every day. If you'll forgive me, I'll just give you a little bit of statistical information. So you will all know that on Wednesday, the 5th of November last year, the overall prison population in Scotland was recorded by the Scottish Prison Service as at 8,431, which was its highest ever recorded number. There are 7,773 available spaces. So that was 656 more prisoners than places. Today, we are 5 short of that record number, despite the several early releases. And as you, again, will know if you've heard my predecessors, Stephen, when he was acting in my role before I took up position, that also doesn't give you the full extent of where the overpopulation sits. So with the current overpopulation, it's 11 out of the 17 prisons that are overcrowded, and always it is Barlinnie which has the largest number, and therefore I would argue that the Barlinnie prisoners have the most restrictive regimes, are most locked behind their doors, because that's one of the consequences of overcrowding.
How much work can you do in advance to predict what your population is going to be in the future? So, like the Crown Office or prosecution services, to see how many people look as if they will get a custodial sentence.
So this isn't our area of responsibility, but it's a really critical point, and good data analysis, collection, use is absolutely critical, and we would definitely recommend that in the future session, this is an area that's looked at very with a great attention to detail. As I said earlier, I was told that there was an impact assessment done of the change of legislation for long-term prisoners. If there was, it hasn't made its way into planning for prison places, as far as I can tell. If you've looked at any of the international work around how to reduce prison populations, one of the key things is data, understanding exactly who your population is made up of, predicting where your population will go, and understanding what needs to be done as a consequence of that. I know that the Justice Analytical Service has done that. At the moment, I understand those figures are only for 6 months, which is obviously not long enough in advance. And I have also heard that they have a high and a low and a mean that are so wide that that's not necessarily very helpful in terms of planning. So we would definitely urge the need for good understanding, good modelling, and planning accordingly.
And can I just add to that in terms of the overcrowding bit? In the 11 prisons that are currently overcrowded, they are holding 900 more prisoners than they're designed to do. So in reality, that means 1,800 prisoners doubled up in cells that are really designed for single use, but having to be used as double cells.
As that brings me on to the next question, are there any particular parts of the prison estate where capacity pressures are most acute?
That is Barlinnie, without question. It is Barlinnie, so it's holding 400 more prisoners than it's designed to do. It's more than 40% above capacity, and that's the most significant. But it's not the only one. We would also argue that even smaller prisons that are still holding more than they're designed. In essence, they're also under pressure as well. So you can't do it purely on a kind of numbers game. The problem with the overcrowding, the problem with the lack of progression, and the blockers in the system around the progression system mean that people are not getting to the national top end, and they're not getting through to the open estate at Castle Huntly as quickly as they should do. They're missing the parole board windows as well, because they're not getting to do a programme when they need to. So the parole board says, well, you haven't done the offender behaviour programme, therefore you fail your parole board, and therefore you're kept in prison for a year longer than may be necessary. So there are pressures throughout the system.
And the opportunities in the national top end have reduced, because Letham Hall, which was how many did it hold? It was a decent number of places for people who were then doing that kind of part work in the community, preparing for release, had to be repurposed and is now used for offence protection, because those numbers increased so much. So there's actually less opportunity just in terms of spaces for prisoners to progress to national top end.
So a lot of the rehabilitation work isn't happening because the prisons are too overcrowded and we haven't got enough staff there to allow all this rehabilitation to happen. So do we need more capacity?
We need more capacity in programme delivery, so that is really affected. There's a shortage of social work teams in some prisons. There's a shortage of psychologists as well, so that there are shortages in a number of different key areas.
Right, and just earlier you'd mentioned about the people within were prisons, so you'd said about elderly, infirm, dementia. There was a previous report by Wendy Sinclair Gibbons who'd said that we needed to go in and look at the estate and the models that we were providing. So I've probably always referred to it as a secure care home. But are there conversations taking place, and how far along the line are we to looking at providing models within the estate that actually meet the needs of the prison population, but also mean that, I suppose, victims are seeing justice for those that have committed the crimes are still serving a sentence?
Again, this isn't our area of responsibility. I understand that Scottish Government have absolutely looked at whether or not there may be some ability to repurpose care sector environments to provide precisely that. But there was also, as I understand it, and this really is not my area of expertise, an absolute dearth of those. So there was no easy solution to say there's something that already exists that we can repurpose to use as a secure care home, as you've described it. So my understanding is, yes, that has been looked at. My understanding is that there was not an easy or short-term option. I would, if investment is being made, what people tend to think of, so I have some experience south of the border where new prison building tends to be future-proofed, and future-proof tends to be, well, we can put absolutely anybody in there. I would argue and Scotland has always had a real strong belief in only using incarceration where it's most needed and only putting in those at risk and managing the population down rather than building. So I think my sense of repurposing would be to build for that current older population in a way that could then be used as a care home in the community. If that's also where a shortfall is, were you able to then reduce your population and then take your prison capacity down? So rather than building prisons that can be used for all kinds of prisoners, which we've seen the world over then just get filled, having some sort of something that meets the needs of this potential part of the population, but which can then ultimately meet the needs of the external population when it's no longer needed.
Yeah, so more focused buildings in the States.
We do see prisoners who quite clearly represent no physical threat to the public anymore. Now, that's not to say that there isn't, the victims would fully expect them still to be serve the sentence, and we're not saying that's not right at all. We absolutely understand that, but they pose no physical threat. The people who are being hoisted in and out of beds, they're in wheelchairs, they're using Zimmer frames to get to the shower. So the question is, do those people need to be held in their absolute most secure settings, or could they be held in a different setting that was less, still secure, but less secure than the current high security setting that they're in?
I think that's a difficult question. It's making sure that the victims see justice, and they would expect them to be in a secure location, but they don't cause harm. So this is my last question. As you said earlier, about prison is a last resort, and it's for people that cannot be safely managed in the community, and also maybe removing people that were the least risk to the public. But obviously, once people get to prison, they're there for a reason. And some of them, although they might not cause a risk to the public, are there because of the crimes that they've committed. Are you aware of any other conversations that have taken place on what we could do to fix that problem?
Again, I think the Sentencing and Penal Policy Review look at this whole kind of journey from, as I say, early years to release after incarceration. And I think there's a sense that confidence in different sentences to incarceration. So I think people tend to think, for example, that if you're not in prison, you're somehow not serving a sentence. That's very much not true. Community sentences are still sentences. The people who undergo them will often say they're harder because the expectations on them and the ability to complete them are almost greater. Relatively easy to do time in prison, not so easy to serve the requirements of a community sentence. But also this sense on licence that somehow when you're on licence you're somehow not serving a sentence. You know, a life sentence is a life sentence. You are still serving a life sentence even when you're out in the community on licence. And I think there's a sort of slight misunderstanding that somehow, I don't mean yours, I mean, you know, the communities, that that sentences, you know, cover community payback to being in the community on licence as a life sentence prisoner, under the ability to be recalled if you don't stick to your conditions.
Okay,
Katie Clark. Yes, Katie, then Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much. And I was wanting to ask a little bit more about planning for release, which, as you say, happens towards the end of sentences and the impact of legislative change that you've also referred to. And as you've said, we've had a number of early release programmes. Last week, this committee voted to reduce the release from 40% of sentence to 30% of sentence. And what I was, that obviously was a crisis management, response in many ways. But what I'd like to ask is, how much time does the system really need to be able to put the planning in place, if you like, the steps in place, to be able to respond to legislative change? Because obviously the concern is, with the change from 40% to 30%, that planning for release might not take place in the way that it should.
Again, this is not so much an area that we have a lot of expertise in, and it's not so much an area that we inspect on. Care Inspector would be better placed to answer that. Do we have anything from the progression review that we would want to say?
You may have a view, though, from your experience in terms of when you see the system failing, if you like, and you've spoken about the importance of planning.
But it's so complex because, so for example, one of the things, and again, we don't have enough evidence yet because we're only just beginning to see it, but one of the things that seems to be emerging, and one doesn't always know what the connections are, is that there are more people coming into custody from homelessness, and there seem to be more people going out without having secured accommodation. So we are beginning to see that it looks as if housing is a challenge, but we don't have enough evidence to say definitively this is what's causing it, and we possibly wouldn't, because if it's a local authority pressure, there are particular issues within the community for the people who are needing to be housed by the local authority. But we know absolutely that people not going out to somewhere that they can call home that is safe is a massive cause of both reoffending and re-entering prison custody. So I take that one example that we're just beginning to get some sense is not as straightforward, but I'm sure the pressures are not just prison pressures. We know that there was a delay in the implementation of the short-term releases and the tranche in order to try to allow services to kind of prepare, be ready, understand who was coming back into the community and what services they needed. But in terms of evidence on exactly which aspects were hit and which were not hit, and what the challenges are, I'm afraid we don't have information that we can give you unless we have something from the progression review.
I don't think we've got anything direct. What we do know is that there are examples of where prisons do really well at sort of maintaining links with what happens to the prisoner after release in the community and getting feedback and getting a sense of what happens to those prisoners. And we've commended that as good practice. So Grampian is one example. I remember have a really good process for that. And we encourage that more. The other link point I would say to that is one of the issues that worries us also is remand, the high-level remands, because again, with the number of people who are now held on a remand for such long periods, there's an increased risk of them losing the tenancy while they're in prison and losing the job. And even if they're found innocent, then they're released back without a home and without a job. So they're more likely to then be in trouble and tangle with the criminal justice system again.
So what the Cabinet Secretary told us was that in the first tranche of early release, it was accepted that planning had not been as good as it could be, and there was an attempt to learn the lesson of that for the next tranche. Is that something that you've seen, and to what extent do you think planning is improving or in place now? Is that something that you would look at, or again, is that not really something that
we would look at it through the Care Inspectorate in our next inspection, but we haven't got any evidence either way at present.
Yeah, and do you, in terms of rehabilitation, is that something that you would look at in terms of to what extent? Because I know you were responding to Sharon Dowie on some points round about rehabilitation. Is that something that you look at in terms of to what extent it's actually available for individual prisoners? There's, I think, the impression that a lot of people have that if a person's sent to prison that they will get help, that there will be attempts to rehabilitate them, but the evidence that we hear is often that is just not the case. The programmes aren't there. To what extent is that something that you look at, or is that, again, another agency that would more focus on that?
So we work in partnership with every inspection that we do with the Health Inspectorate, to really understand the health services and the level of provision, both before somebody comes into custody, at the point that they're receiving those services in custody, and then signposting on release. We work with the Inspectorate of Education, and they would look at access and quality of education, vocational training, employment, and gymnasium and library. But in terms of that sort of gaining skills and qualifications, improving your education, and I think it would not be unreasonable to say that our conclusion is generally there are never as many spaces as prisoners who need them. However, we also find that the take-up is less. So although there are more people in the prison than there are spaces available, the spaces are not full because there are challenges for all sorts of reasons. It may be staffing, getting people there. We have, over the course of our inspections, seen work areas shut because of staff shortages, and the staff that run the sheds operating on the wings to support just the basics of time in the fresh air, food, etc. But I think we also think that the personal officer and this kind of, support, mentoring, enthusing role, that has also really struggled over the years with the staffing shortages, with the overcrowding. So there isn't somebody kind of a named person who is really trying to get somebody to understand what's available to them, what they might do whilst they're in custody. So you tend to get the same people who are motivated, the same people who would benefit, not being encouraged to participate. If everybody participated, there would not be enough, but not everybody does. And then, as Stephen's alluded to, there is a massive shortfall in terms of the delivery of programmes, which unfortunately at the moment are mostly the ways in which risk is judged to have been reduced.
There's also a lack of access to vocational training, so that's one thing that our Education Scotland, HMIE, colleagues have alluded to, is a real insufficient number of opportunities to acquire a vocational qualification. There have been some good examples of that in Perth. We're just out from there, and they're doing some really good innovative stuff, but it's the exception rather than the rule.
So is it fair to say, from what you're saying, that the main problem is a lack of staff as opposed to prisoners that wish to partake? Is that fair?
I think it's both.
So you think that it's both? Okay, because I think the point about prisoners not being willing is not something that I think particularly we've heard a lot of evidence on, so that's quite interesting. And finally, if we've got time, you spoke about prisoners that present the least risk. And I think there's been many in this Parliament over many years who've taken the view that the prison population in Scotland is too high across the board. It's particularly too high in relation to women prisoners. A lot of politicians would take the view that most women should probably not be in a custodial environment, and that many politicians would take the view that the numbers in Scotland in prison are unacceptably high and the remand levels are too high. But there's this disconnect between policy and implementation. And I wonder, in terms of, and again, it may not be something that you see as directly your role, and that'd be interesting, but in terms of how we as politicians try to grapple with how we make the legislative changes so we identify the prisoners that have to be in prison, and there clearly are many prisoners that have to be in prison, and are able to provide a framework that there's alternatives. Is there anything you can say in terms of how we evaluate which prisoners are the least risk? Do you think that there's more of a role, for example, for prison governors, or is that, what would your view be in terms of how we assess the risk of those that are in prison?
I think if you look, and again, this isn't my great area of expertise, but I think if you look at the countries where they have managed down prison populations, that would be my starting point. So I would look at how, for example, the Netherlands has reduced its prison population. And I understand that one of the things that they adopted was something that I experienced somewhat in the driving down of the number of children being put into custody when I worked in England and Wales. And that was to sort of have that sort of wraparound health, education, social work, skilled groups of people who looked at, so in the youth offending system, right, how do we support this person to stay out of crime? How do we support this person to stay out of prison? How do we divert this person completely from the criminal justice system? And that was a very effective approach to drive down the numbers of children being held in custody. I understand that in Netherlands the approach was somewhat similar, but it was like, how can we wrap around this family that clearly potentially has generational issues of poverty, of lack of education, of health, and then in my simplistic way, they sort of put this youth offending team, but around the families. So it wasn't so much about identifying risk, although I think that's where you're at in terms of your current population, but it was about how can we actually reduce the people going into prison by offering alternatives in the community that then prevent the sort of behaviour that is bringing them in front of the courts and then and ending up with them in prison. So I would commend looking at those who have been successful in driving down their prison populations in Europe.
Thank you.
To time, but I do have a couple of members looking to come in. If I can ask for your forbearance, maybe for another 10 minutes or so. So obviously very interesting issues coming up. So I'm bringing Pauline McNeill and then Fulton McGregor.
Good morning. I wanted to ask about the ongoing issue of the overcrowding in prisons and the conditions which some prisoners are maybe experiencing worse, I suppose, experiences than others. And you talked about Barlinnie, which is the obvious place to start. I mean, maybe it's beyond your remit, but I'll ask you anyway. Do you have any concerns about prisoners who are serving their sentence in a place like Barlinnie, which is extremely overcrowded? They're doubling up. When compared to a prisoner who is not serving a similar sentence in another jail, is there a human rights issue here? Or just you would think that what you'd be aiming for is to make sure that all prisoners, when they're serving the sentence, have broadly similar conditions and access to rehabilitation. Is there anything you want to say?
I mean, I think obviously our focus is and has to be on sort of international standards, access to fresh air, access to family, access to health. And I think you are right that absolutely, if you are in an overcrowded, a more overcrowded prison, your access to health, for example, will almost inevitably be curtailed compared with that of somebody in a prison where they're not overcrowded. We know that the prison service has focused incredibly strongly on trying to ensure that, for example, an hour in the fresh air is not breached. But we are also aware of places where prisoners have been it's been explained to prisoners that because we have such a large number of people who are being isolated because of their substance misuse and prisoners who are being isolated because of their being placed on Rule 95, you are actually only going to get half an hour because that's the only way that we can manage it. So, so there are actually, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of official breaches, communication to prisoners that they are not meeting statutory minimum requirements, and I think that is absolutely a consequence of the overcrowding situation.
Thank you. Kind of similar theme. I mean, I had a prisoner, or someone on behalf of a prisoner wrote to me about conditions in Barlinnie, and not for the first time. He's serving an 8-year sentence in a jail that's designed for short-term prisoners. But it's been happening, in my experience, it's been happening for years, way beyond the levels of... do you look at that at all? Is that something that's come across your experience?
We look at the population that is within the prison. One of the things that we've been able to do in the last 4 years is introduce a pre-inspection survey, which tells us the views and the experience of a diverse range of people within the prisons, so we hear from the longer termers, we hear from the shorter termers, so we can see within any one prison where the experience varies and where it's similar. So that's the basis on which our remand thematic review was able to be undertaken. So we can get some kind of headline information about where those differences sit and what people's experience is. I think there has been a population strategy. It happens that somebody who's seconded into our team at the moment previously worked for the SPS and was responsible for that. I know that people are now back working on that. I think you would absolutely need to talk to the SPS about this, but this idea that you have some prisons which specialise in particular roles and responsibilities. Rona's pointed out to the frustrations in Bella and Lilias for the long-term women, seeing short-term women come and go. So those are very real experiences and very real perceptions, and it would take a significant population strategy and again a shorter, mid and long-term vision. And I think the sense is at the moment that the overpopulation is such that it's just managing to put people where there are spaces, so it's very hard to have a strategy in those circumstances.
I know this has been happening for a lot longer. I'll go as far back as 10 years when I visited Berlin, and not surprised anymore to find that a prisoner serving a sentence in Berlin. I could never understand it. Anyway, I just thought I'd ask you if something you looked at, but thanks very much for that answer. Just lastly, this committee are interested in the Orders for Lifelong Restriction. We've got a round table on Thursday. I don't know if there's any comment you could make on that, but you're probably familiar with this sort of pattern here. I actually did the legislation way back in the day, and I never thought that when we gave the courts this extended sentence, which we do need for the more serious of cases, that it would have resulted in pretty much, I think over 90% of people who have completed the punishment part remain in jail. I can tell you as a legislator, I never thought that's what it was for. I'm surprised, and it just seems it's very difficult to question this or understand it. I understand that one of the reasons, back to Katie Clark's line of question, is a lack of access to rehab. I'm sure it's not as simple as that. Do you look at these sort of things when you're going into prisons, if you've got prisoners there who are under these restrictions, or does that not something you do?
So we will speak to prisoners who are serving orders of lifelong restriction, and we will hear what their experience is, whether that's for good or ill. We have not conducted a thematic in that particular area, although it is something that we could do because clearly we know who those people are. One of the things that I think, you know, some of these complexities, and I know I cannot extrapolate from a single story, but my very first inspection here, I met a young man who was on non-offence protection, and he was telling me that he was serving an order of lifelong restriction, and he told me, I've served 17 years, and 13 of those years I've done in the digger, and he had just been diagnosed properly with autism. When I say properly, he'd been through the assessment and had autism, and was now receiving support in a not perfect because it's in a prison environment, but properly for his autism, and some real senses that there are maybe complexities sitting underneath those sentences that would bear exploration, but it's not an area that we have gone into. But
it is open to you to have a review about this. I mean, it seems to me that it should be somebody's role to have an independent sort of assessment of whether or not those prisoners that are serving well beyond their punishment part, no one seems to have, so far, seems to have any remit to say whether or not this has exceeded the legislation or the needs a review of the legislation. But I know that wouldn't all be you, but some of it would be you, would it?
Yes, I mean we would be tending to reflect on what their experience is, what's happened for them during their sentence, what hasn't happened for them during their sentence, what health needs they have, what family needs they have. So we would be very kind of focused around.
But not the blockage. It wouldn't be your remit if there's a blockage in getting out of jail because the services, whether it's mental health or is not your remit.
Yeah, no, that is our remit.
It is, right.
Certainly we would have a role in and would look at the issues around access to programmes, access to support, mental health, whatever else it may be. The other thing to say linked to that is that the management of those cases is actually very time-consuming and onerous for the prison service. So actually, this is another burden on the prison service that was unanticipated, because you're absolutely right. My understanding is when the legislation went through, we thought we'd have about 50 cases, no more than that, and we're up at 250 or something, at 300. So the process of having regular dialogue, annual case conferences, reviewing what more can be done is extremely onerous to the prison
And no
service.
one's made representations to you then about having a look, because it just seems like an obvious thing.
Well, the Scottish Human Rights Commission has come out with it.
Which is why we'd like to find in the last 2 weeks of the Parliament. But it is a controversial issue now, I think.
The Scottish Human Rights Commission came out with its report to kind of really highlight the issue of what is happening with this group and we were pleased that they'd raised those issues, and we're very sympathetic to the need for somebody to have a look at it. But we haven't really had resources ourselves to launch a thematic, because we're doing a whole review of our inspection standards, but it's something we would like to look at in due course.
Thank you very much.
And very briefly, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Convener. I will be quite brief. It's just a quick question you'll be glad to hear. It's just going back to something that you mentioned in your opening statement, Sarah, and that is about the Women's Hub that's at the State Hospital at Carstairs. And probably actually just looking at Clark's here, I should probably declare an interest in it. My wife is a social worker at the State Hospital, and she deals with the Women's Hub as well. Obviously, you'll be aware it's only very small numbers just now, and it's only on an interim basis. So on that basis, how do you think that is going to help, in terms of the prison service that you mentioned? Or are you more talking about when it's likely to expand, that it will be a more helpful situation over time, as opposed to just now? Just wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Sorry, to make sure I've understood your question, do we think that having mental health capacity in Scotland as opposed to south of the border for women will be an advantage?
Yes, in terms of what you referred to in your opening.
Yes.
Because I guess the point I'm making is it's a very small service just now, and it's in its interim phase. Obviously, it's going through its assessment phase, which I think we all hope, everyone in the committee, I guess, would hope as well, that it will be expanded. But it's weird how you see that fitting into your own work and what benefits it might bring.
I think again, it's really interesting, and it's something that we're trying to understand better, and it's also something that we're trying to work on as the subgroup of the National Preventive Mechanism within Scotland, is sort of really understanding what's happening from a mental health perspective, and not just for women but for men. So one of the things that we are asking but we don't yet know is Rule 41, which is a way of isolating somebody because of their health needs rather than because of their safety to others or safety to themselves needs, seems to be possibly underused. So we very rarely see it being used. I think it was used more during COVID. I think sometimes it's used where there's a very clear physical illness that potentially risks contagion, but it seems to be more sparingly used. And then there's also something about people becoming well and less well and well and less well, which makes their kind of access into community, more appropriate community-based secure mental health provision quite difficult to track. But it's one of the things that we're trying to get more data about, get more understanding of, and hopefully have better evidence around what's happening, and whether in fact there is a disadvantage to some people perhaps being held on Rule 95 when they should be being held on Rule 41 and progressing into better health care. But it's a sort of area that we're struggling to make sure that we've got the right information about and are pursuing properly.
Certainly, just to add to that, there are a high number, a relatively small number of women in Stirling HMP Stirling who have very high mental health needs and who are very difficult for the prison staff there to look after, who arguably may be better looked after in a non-prison setting, in a psychiatric secure setting. I think part of the aspiration for the high secure psychiatric unit for women in the state hospital was that some people who were being held probably inappropriately in medium secure settings would then be able to move to the high secure setting, and therefore that would free up spaces for other people who maybe could benefit from that space. So there could be a kind of knock-on benefit, is the point I'm saying, of having that facility, as well as the fact that people don't actually have to now go south of the border for that type of support that they clearly need.
Thank you. I wonder if I can just finish with a question, and it really comes from the unfortunate news this weekend of the death of a 19-year-old boy at Polmont. I'm just interested in perhaps a little bit of information about when Polmont was last inspected, and what is the role, or what is your role in the aftermath of an incident like this, in terms of, I suppose, if nothing else, providing reassurance that Polmont is not an unsafe environment?
So clearly we were extremely saddened to hear that, every death in custody is terrible for the family, for the people who know the person, and clearly also for the staff. So we were extremely saddened to hear that news. We did inspect Polmont back in August, and a report with slightly terrible timing is due to be published before Parliament ends. And that was a pilot where we were trying to begin to develop a methodology that we could use in every prison that we go to understand the preventive factors and what we think would be a supportive environment to encourage people to feel safe and to report if they don't feel well, to have mental health provision where that's necessary, and also very specifically to look at the fatal accident inquiry recommendations that came from the deaths of Katie and William back in 2018. As you will see when that report is published, it was a mixed picture. There was a lot done in terms of the specific FAI recommendations. Our concern as the inspectorate was that they were very much about preventing very specific things. Tragically, again, ligatures being used for people to complete suicide. We're worried also about natural deaths in prison and deaths through substance misuse, but we had to start small, and we've started initially looking at completed suicides. But very much this sort of what is the environment like? What's available to people? Picking up that sense of, can people access things that are meaningful to them? Can they make relationships both with their peers and with staff? And how much time is there out of cell in order to do those things? All of which are, we think, critical, and we're in the process of building that methodology, and it will be part of our revised standards where, when we visit every prison, we will make some judgments both about the overall environment and how those preventive factors come together, but specifically on what action is being taken against the internal learning about deaths in custody and anything externally from the fatal accident inquiries. We're very much at the beginning of that work.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have run over. Apologies for that. I think it's been a really helpful session. So thank you all to our panel. And I can just say, extend our best wishes to Stephen on your impending retirement, and Callum too. Well, very best wishes from the committee on your retirements. And with that, we'll have a short suspension to allow a changeover of our panel. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, members. So I'm very pleased that we're now joined by Craig Naylor, HM Chief Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland, and Deborah O'Brien-Demick, HM Chief Inspector of Prosecutions in Scotland. So I refer members to paper number 1, and I intend to allow up to 60 minutes for this session. So can I invite Craig, then Deborah, to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, committee. Thank you for the invite to speak with you today, and I welcome the opportunity to update you on the recent work of HMICS and to set out some of the key findings from 23 and 24 and 24 and 25. Our joint inspection with the Prosecution Inspectorate, which I'm sure we'll both talk about, into the witness citation system, and our recently published Best Value in Policing audit with Audit Scotland. HMICS has been an independent scrutiny body since the 19th century, and our role was reaffirmed by the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012. Our statutory powers require us to examine the state, efficiency and effectiveness of both Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. We are also responsible for providing assurance that best value and continuous improvement are being delivered. Over the last 2 years, our work has focused on areas central to public trust in policing: organisational culture, vetting, well-being, governance and the experience of those who interact with the justice system. We've worked closely with other scrutiny bodies to ensure that policing performance is viewed in the wider context of justice, health and social care. We've carried out a broad programme of inspections in 23-24, looking at organisational culture, vetting, mental health demand, well-being and forensic toxicology. We worked with partners on inspections relating to custody, children at risk of harm and adult support and protection. These inspections highlighted both strengths and areas where improvement is required. And we also supported parliamentary scrutiny of the Police Ethics Conduct Scrutiny and Scotland Act, as it now is, by providing evidence drawn from our vetting review. That work directly informed the inclusion of new requirements within the bill on vetting processes and regulations, which I understand will be discussed later this morning. In 24-25, we completed our first 3-year scrutiny plan and launched our new plan for 2025-28. We updated our inspection frameworks, giving Police Scotland, the SPA and forensic services clearer expectations. Our assurance model has matured. We expect self-assessments conducted by policing bodies themselves to inform our scrutiny work, and these assessments show an improvement in quality and a better embedding of continuous improvement processes. We also published several significant reports, including reviews of the SPA, road policing, missing persons and well-being. To increase transparency, we launched a public online tracker showing how progress is made against the recommendations we make. I just want to pull out 2 or 3 of the key reports over that period of time, the first one being mental health demand. In October 2023, we published a thematic review on mental health-related policing demand. Our findings were stark. Mental health-related incidents remain one of the most significant pressures on Police Scotland. The police often find themselves providing care and support in situations that should be handled by health or social care services. While we acknowledge improvements in the whole system, including the creation of a mental health task force and a strategic oversight board, the pace of system-wide change is not keeping up with the demand. A sustainable whole-system approach is required. Best value in policing. Our joint work with Audit Scotland is being discussed in the Public Audit Committee this morning, and policing is being looked at as a well-managed, well-led organisation with strong partnership working. Further reform is needed to maximise the use of resources. Clearer performance measures, better baseline data and more robust workforce planning are required. Policing also continues to be constrained by financial rules that prevent reserves being carried across financial years. Major change programmes, particularly estate reform and digital transformation, would benefit from greater flexibility and longer-term financial planning. I won't touch on citations because I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. But in conclusion, policing in Scotland is on a positive trajectory, with improved governance, culture and assurance. But challenges remain, particularly in relation to mental health, modernisation of justice processes and long-term sustainability. Our work clearly shows that stronger collaboration across the justice, health and care systems is essential if we're to deliver better outcomes for the public we serve. Thank you.
can come back to the best value in policing joint report that was published, obviously a piece of work undertaken by yourself and Audit Scotland. And if I can just lift from the submission that you sent the committee in advance of today's session, what you say is overall the audit finds policing is in a positive trajectory, but must accelerate transformation, address workforce planning and demonstrate continuous improvement across all services. One of the concerns that you raise is the medium-term financial plan, which needs updated, and you point out the inability of policing to maintain reserves or carry money between years causes problems, particularly in relation to expenditure with regard to large capital projects. And it's safe to say that's come up on probably a fairly regular basis over the last few months as we've been in particular scrutinising the budget. So I'm just very interested to hear maybe a little bit more on that particular issue around financial planning, and I suppose importantly what your recommendations are with regard to how that can be addressed. And obviously we are aware of the Scottish Government having some dialogue with the UK Government in this particular issue around borrowing and carrying reserves.
Thank you. There are a number of threads to that. One is around the revenue budget and how they spend the money year on year and that medium-term financial planning. You'll recall that round about 2020-2021, Stephen Boyle, as Auditor General, was responsible for a number of Section 22 notices about the way that they were meeting their budget requirements. We've not seen that since that period of time, so we now see a stronger financial model, in-year controls, better management of the expenditure. However, the longer term, how they align their income that they expect to get with the resources they need to have on the ground, so the head count of police officers and police staff is critical. They are working on a medium-term financial plan, but they have not yet delivered a refreshed one, and they're due to do that in this coming year. And we're very keen to see something on that. Turning to capital, spending capital allocated in 1 year is incredibly difficult, especially if you're looking at large-scale projects like an IT new system delivery or a building of a premises or something similar. Looking at the capital that they are very low on the capital expenditure in comparison to forces in England and Wales. And I used this number when I was at the Public Audit Committee. When I was Deputy Chief Constable in Lincolnshire Police, a force about a tenth of the size of Police Scotland, my capital budget was half of the Police Scotland capital budget. So in comparable years, I was able to spend significantly more per head of population or per head of the organisation in delivering effective outcomes. And what did that allow me to do? It allowed me to have second generation, at that point, body-worn video. It allowed me to have mobile devices that were updated and linking into 28 of the policing systems that we had on our infrastructure from someone's from someone's mobile data device. That efficiency was assessed by Lincoln University at 15% improvement in productivity per officer per day. So it's 1.5 hours out of a 10-hour day that they had time to invest in proactive policing or dealing with other matters. So in terms of where Police Scotland is, they have a smaller capital budget per any metric you could possibly imagine. They get it and they have to spend it in the same year, which makes long-term planning very, very difficult. And they do things that are quite ingenious in terms of over-profiling their spend. So it looks like they're going to spend more than they get. But because of slippage in projects, they come in pretty much on budget, and they've done that quite effectively over the last 5 or 6 years. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Before I ask my follow-up question, I'm sure members noted my deliberate mistake, and I omitted to bring in Deborah to make your opening remarks. So huge apologies for that. I was quite keen to get on. So I'll come back to Craig and ask a follow-up question, and then I'll bring you in. So my huge apologies. I'm very embarrassed.
Absolutely no problem whatsoever. It's my first time at committee, so I don't know any different.
Good stuff. Okay. Craig, thank you for that. That all makes sense. And obviously, you also refer to the the focus on the estate programme that Police Scotland is undertaking. A significant piece of work to sort of change the estate profile, so that they can kind of get the right buildings in the right place. That I suppose maintains community or public confidence in policing and that sort of community-based element of it. Just moving on to the strategic workforce plan for policing, you comment that is underdeveloped and the evidence base for the officer number and staff mix is not well evidenced. Just interested in a wee bit more on that particular aspect of the inspection.
We inspected the strategic workforce planning about 3 years ago, and one of the things that we noted was that they had tried in several different ways to come up with a strategic workforce plan that linked to the threat and risk that they were facing, but also linked to the finances that they were likely to get. So when we went back with Audit Scotland, we again looked at this because it's a key area of service delivery. And one of the issues that we found was there is no magic algorithm that says how many police officers you need for a country like Scotland, or indeed for a county in England or Wales. But what they do, and what they're getting increasingly better at, is to understand the threats that they're facing, to understand the changes in the dynamics of crime, of the incidents they receive. And we spoke at length in this and in other inspections about mental health demand and people in crisis. So to sit down and say 16,500 officers, or what the Chief wanted was another 900, I think it was, is the right number, is very, very difficult to say. But what we are seeing is emerging good practice in the community policing model that they are rolling out. It was piloted in Forth Valley and in the Highland Division, and they're looking to roll that out over coming years. The development of that understanding of demand in local communities is a very good model, we think, on how they can show what they need in each local authority area or each community. And when they can do that more effectively, that will allow them to better define what the organisation needs in terms of not just numbers, but skill sets and experience and capability. The bigger bit then is how do you link that to your finance. And one of the problems that Police Scotland have is they have distinct systems that cover finance, that cover human resources, that cover duty allocations and allocating people into shifts, etc. There is a need for improvement in that because much of that technology is 20 plus years old and doesn't allow for easy understanding of the data, understanding of the pressures, and then linking it back into the ongoing threat and intelligence assessments. So we would really like them to make a real focus on that over coming years. But when you don't have the capital to spend on that sort of system, you would expect an Oracle-type system or a software-as-a-service type system is going to cost them £30 or £40 million, and they just don't have that capital when they've got gaps in their estate budget, gaps in their fleet budget, gaps in their existing IT budgets.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Deborah, would you like to make some opening remarks and then we'll open up to questions?
Absolutely. Good morning, Convener. Good morning to the committee. Thank you for inviting me to give evidence today. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prosecution in Scotland to talk about our work, our recent joint inspection on citations, which actually I will touch on a little in my opening comments, if I may, and the challenges facing both our inspectorates and the wider criminal justice system. Let me start with a brief reminder of our role. Our statutory role is to inspect the operation of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, COPFS. We are independent from COPFS and the Scottish Government. Our focus is the quality of the prosecution service delivered to the public, Our inspection reports highlight what's working well and where improvements and developments can be made, with recommendations designed to strengthen the effectiveness and efficiency the service COPFS delivers. Despite being a very small team, just 4.57 full-time equivalent staff, we consistently deliver high-quality evidence-based inspection reports. Recent work has covered domestic abuse prosecutions, diversion from prosecution and the COPFS National Call Centre. These inspections have shone a light on important areas of prosecution work and contributed to meaningful improvements and necessary practical change. Turning to our challenges, first, resourcing. I am mindful of the pressure on public sector finance, but it is important to make the committee aware that of our 4.57 staff, only 3.57 carry out daily inspection activities. In contrast, the organisation we inspect employed 2,416 people last year. As COPFS has expanded both the number and priorities, our capacity has not, and this makes it increasingly difficult to inspect the organisation effectively or follow up on all previous work. Our budget for 2026 to 27 leaves us over budget on staffing alone, limiting what else we can do. Our total budget is only 0.2% of that of COPFS. Our second challenge is the implementation of recommendations. It's important to say that I do not have a statutory power to compel COPFS to implement our recommendations. COPFS supports our work and accepts our recommendations, but implementation is sometimes slower than we would hope. We publish COPFS progress against each recommendation in our annual reports, and we continue to publicise this information until all accepted recommendations are achieved. Monitoring progress takes my inspectorate considerable time and is challenging when we are also conducting inspections. When recommendations remain open for several years, the burden grows. Let me turn now to our recent joint inspection on citations with HMICS, published just last week, of which the committee has a copy. This was the first time the citation process has been reviewed end to end, from full police statement right through to witness attendance at trial, despite its fundamental importance to the criminal justice system. The report contains 50 recommendations aimed at creating a more efficient and more witness-centred citation process. Last year, almost 400,000 formal citations were issued for Sheriff Court witnesses. Most civilian witnesses still receive citations by second-class post. A key recommendation is that COPFS use email or another electronic method to cite witnesses. Across both organisations, we also found a clear lack of leadership and governance and no accurate understanding of the overall cost of the citation process. While summary case management, which the committee will have heard about, has reduced the number of citations issued, it hasn't addressed the underlying problems in the citation process itself. A certain number of witnesses will always require to be cited and to give evidence at trial. A recurring theme, again one the committee will be familiar with, is churn. Trials being repeatedly adjourned because citation was not effective. We saw valuable practice in other jurisdictions, including emailed notice of trial letters, which are more trauma-informed and reduce the need for police officers to deliver citations in person. Another key recommendation is for the Scottish Government to work with COPFS and other justice partners to develop an integrated digital trial scheduling system that takes account of witness availability in fixing trials. Again, I recognise that budgets are tight across the public sector, but this type of investment would reduce excusals, adjournments and churn, alongside the significant costs that come with them. Importantly, it would also improve the experience for witnesses. I hope that's helpful, and I'm very happy to any questions the committee may have of me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think just on the witness citation review, I know members are interested to come in with questions, but I can certainly vouch for the challenges. I think probably all members can, by way of correspondence from constituents, some professional witnesses who have their diaries routinely disrupted because of citations. So really looking forward to hearing more about the report. I wonder if I can just briefly come back to one of the other pieces of recent work that's been undertaken, and that's the review into the prosecution of domestic abuse cases at sheriff summary level. And among the recommendations that you made was that Crown Office should take immediate steps to ensure that victims are receiving basic information about their case timeously. And in a case review, IPS found that only 33% of victims were fully or mostly advised of key dates in their cases, and the overall quality of communication was assessed as unsatisfactory in 80% of the victims that you engaged with. I wonder if you can. I mean, that seems like a basic provision in my mind. So I wonder if you can maybe just talk through a little bit more about that inspection and some of the key recommendations that came from it.
Yes, of course, I'd be very happy to, Convener. That also links to the point I was making in my opening comments about implementation and pace of implementation. So it's important to say that my inspectorate works very closely with the implementation leads across all of the inspection topics that we have ongoing with COPFS. I might make comment on how that works in practical terms, if I may, and then circle back to domestic abuse, because I think it's important to make this point. So the way that it tends to work in terms of implementation is there is an implementation lead who's usually a prosecutor or a leader who has the knowledge to implement the relevant inspection. So, for example, in relation to domestic abuse, it is the COPFS lead on domestic abuse. That individual also obviously has an operational job, and they need to straddle both those roles. Previously, there had also been working groups that govern the implementation of inspection recommendations and support that implementation lead. Most recently, we were told that the inspection lead for the National Inquiry Point was being ring-fenced to implement the recommendation and would have an associated working group. But we've recently learned that that working group no longer exists. We understand that under the auspices of Designed for Success, DFS, which of course the committee will have heard of before, that governance, including implementation of our recommendations in inspection reports, is under consideration of how COPFS is going to continue to take that forward. So I think that's important for the committee to be aware of in general terms. In relation to domestic abuse, we commented in our annual report about the pace of implementation. There are some really good news stories in relation to domestic abuse, and of course tackling violence against women and girls is a key strategic priority for COPFS. We've seen that they have channelled a great deal of improvement in relation to guidance with the Domestic Abuse Handbook for prosecutors and practitioners, and also of training. And certainly we've attended the training facilitated by COPFS, and that is of a very high standard. And clearly that's the foundation on which prosecutors can start to build skills in the prosecution of these very sensitive and difficult cases, and engage further with victims in terms of summary case management and early victim engagement. But to my mind, and again I commented on it in the annual report, so it's interesting that you draw that out for me to talk about this morning, is what practical change has been brought about for victims of domestic abuse from April 2024, when we published this report, to March 2026. And that for me is perhaps where COPFS is lacking. We have provided a breakdown of the number of recommendations which have been achieved. We broke it down to 47 recommendations rather than 27. There were a lot of A, B, C, D, E's in that inspection report. So we assessed, as at November last year, that 2 recommendations were achieved, 8 were substantially progressed, 27 were in progress, and 10, including the recommendation which you mentioned, Convener, had not been achieved. So as a result of that, because I feel strongly about the need to bring about practical change and to be able to demonstrate that to the public. Our next piece of inspection work is going to be looking in particular at the provision of basic information and communication with victims of domestic abuse. We plan, now that we've finished the citations inspection, to revisit that in a very short, focused way, and we will go back to the original pilot offices that implemented SCM to see how SCM and early victim engagement is working in practice, because to my mind that's vitally important. It is also important, I think, to say that our conversations with COPFS have been extremely positive in relation to implementation of domestic abuse, and to that end they have identified another senior leader, a Sheriff and Procurator Fiscal in local court, who is also going to be responsible for implementation of what I would describe as the more practical, meaningful recommendations that we want to see make a difference to victims of domestic abuse in the Sheriff Court, and that's particularly encouraging to me.
That is encouraging to hear, so we'll look forward to sort of monitoring that. Okay, I'm going to open up to members, and I'll bring in Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Deborah, I'll take you to the witness citation report, which is a considerable undertaking and output.
Yes.
But it seems to me, in summary, it's a pretty frank assessment of the process. And it seems to me, to pick up Craig Naylor's words in his submission to us, that it's antiquated, paper-based and inefficient, with substantial negative impacts on witnesses and policing capacity. That's some conclusion.
Yep.
Can you tell me, Deborah, how effective is the collaboration and cooperation and coordination between Police Scotland and the Crown Office in managing the citation process? And if it could be better, are there structural issues impacting upon it?
Well, I don't think that there are structural issues at the heart of it. The structure exists between COPFS and Police Scotland. I think the fundamental question is whether it's being used efficiently. So at the moment, the way that it operates is there are national groups that meet between COPFS and Police Scotland, but there are also groups that meet at divisional level. And what I would say is that there is not a flow of information between those two groups, nor a citation, for example, a regular agenda item on those meetings. So there is not a flow of information. Certainly that was one of the observations that we had throughout our inspection activity. I think it's also fair to say, you say it's a tough read, it's deliberately so. It's a process, as I said in my opening remarks, that's fundamental to the way in which our criminal justice system works, yet no one's really paused and looked at it. But there are some good news stories peppered, I think, throughout that report. One of those is that Police Scotland had quite rightly identified that they were serving far too many witness citations personally, and wondered what work might be done. So COPFS and Police Scotland collaborated together to extend the amount of time that witnesses have to return postal citations from 21 to 28 days in summary cases, and from 7 to 28 days in sheriff and jury cases. And the results were more or less positive, perhaps a little blip, as you'll see from the report in relation to sheriff and jury figures last summer, in terms of the amount of citations which police officers require to serve personally, which can only be a positive thing because, as I'm sure we might talk about later, police are far better served in going out and being in communities and catching the bad guys. So it is a really good example of the way that it can work in a targeted way between COPFS and Police Scotland to bring about practical results that make a difference.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll stay on that point because you talked about the considerable consequences of what's been going on. And you mentioned, and again, Mr. Naylor talked about this, the personal service citation demands have a significant impact on police and their workloads, and it reduces their time for frontline duties, which is something this committee has been very concerned about.
Of course.
More generally. Deborah, you've just talked there about there being nothing structural. You said there are groups there, but there wasn't a regular agenda item. But the report also looks at, it says there's a lack of oversight, a lack of leadership, lack of governance, strategy and monitoring of this process across both organisations. Given that this committee's heard an awful lot about funding and resource pressures on these organisations and the need to stop excessive or unnecessary spend and time, what did you find was being done prior to your report to address these things? Or do you get the sense that the lack of oversight and leadership that you've referred to led to nothing material being done until you had to produce a report to say, no, this is what you need to deal with?
Well, the piece of work I've just referred to between COPFS and Police Scotland happened before publication of the report. So that was already in train. We await the formal responses from Police Scotland and COPFS in relation to our report, because it was only just published last week. We don't actually know at present if they accept all of the recommendations, the 50 recommendations that we have made. And so they can indicate to us in their action plans, which will be sent from their implementation leads, what they plan to do in response to our report. We are aware, from having met with senior officials from Police Scotland and COPFS not long before we plan to publish our report, to give them the high-level messaging, which we always tend to do, so they're not getting too much of a surprise when we publish. And certainly there was an indication at that point that COPFS was going to be considering citations strategy, and in particular was going to be focusing on the witness excusal process, which you'll see from our report is something which we assess that COPFS deals with particularly badly. And it's massively impactful on all witnesses, whether you're a victim, a civilian, a professional, as the convener referred to, or a police officer. And indeed, when I talk about practical and meaningful change, that's a recommendation which we have put a time limit on, that COPFS have to change and create a process for excusal requests within 6 months of publication of our report. That's not something we've done at IPS before. I've done it sparingly. There only are 3 recommendations with time limits, because I need to accept it's not for me to dictate the business priorities of COPFS. But it's certainly something that the Inspectorate of the CPS does. And so I decided to use that ability in a sparing but targeted way in relation to citation process.
Thank you. Craig.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of things that I would maybe want to raise with the committee. This is very much about, are you doing the right thing? And if you're doing the right thing, are you doing it well? Now, what both services have looked at is very much improving the practice of how they do what they currently do. They've not looked at change. And if I look at the evidence we have from our inspection, the way citations are delivered is pretty much the same as 37 years ago when I joined Lothian Borders Police. A cop is given a handful of citations and told to go and find the person in the community, knock on their door, with no real cognizance of what they've been through to become a witness in this case, and then personally serve a document on them that says if you don't turn up, you might be arrested. That's not trauma-informed, and it goes back 37 years when I first did it in about 3 miles away from here in Craigmillar. For the last 30 years, I've had the same email address. I've moved house 4 times in that period of time, so it's actually easier to find me by email than it is to find me by postal service. So when every other service that you probably engage in is going digital, it's concerning that Justice has not followed suit despite the Scottish Government's views on digital service and digital public delivery. So our biggest concern on this was we are still doing things in, as I said, an antiquated manner, delivering bits of paper that warn you might be arrested if you don't follow suit with what's said in it. So we want to see significant change in doing the right thing and then getting that right in the way they deliver it.
Thank you. So finally from me, I'll come back to Deborah, but it was only because you mentioned it in your opening remarks. But on that exact point, Deborah, you said that there were two key recommendations, and you specifically said the Crown Office to use email to cite witnesses, and the second one you said the Scottish Government to work with the Crown Office and Justice Partners on a digital trial scheduling solution.
Yes.
You then also told us that you've no power to compel anyone to do this. So it begs two questions. First of all, do you get any sense of this happening? Will this change both that Craig's talked about, the email and the digital trial solution? Is that going to happen? Who is going to lead on that from these organisations? And particularly in relation to the digital trial solution, who's going to pay for it?
Is that a question for Craig or me?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm happy to. Do you want to start? And I'm very happy to come in as well on that.
What we saw during the inspection was very good examples, particularly in Northern Ireland, of the capability to get information effectively from witnesses, to then schedule a trial using, I'm not sure if it was AI, but certainly some form of algorithm that picks from the availability dates of the civilian witnesses, the professional witnesses and the police officers, the three most likely dates where you can get everyone there without disrupting their whole lives, cite them effectively and get them to the court. There is a far lower churn rate when you do that. There is a far greater attendance at court of the victims, the witnesses and professional witnesses, and you get an outcome from the justice process at a far earlier point. Now, if you think about every time a witness attends court from a civilian perspective, they're entitled to expenses, they're entitled to payment for their lost earnings, they're entitled to childcare costs. Every time you attend court as a civilian witness, there is that personal impact, but the financial impact on the justice system. So if you go 4 or 5 times and don't give evidence, that's 4 or 5 times these expenses rack up. If you add into that a police officer either on leave or on overtime or on a rest day, that racks up, and likewise with a professional witness. All of these costs, if you do it more efficiently and more effectively, and you reduce the churn, and you reduce the number of excusal requests coming in because someone is away on leave or they've got a wedding or something similar booked, if you do that, you get better outcomes, you get more trauma-informed practice, and you reduce the costs. So this is a spend to save recommendation. This is something that if we get it right, and the Chief Constable, I think, has mentioned previously to this committee, or certainly to a committee in this building, £3.4 million costs per annum on overtime for police officers attending court. Now, it's a core duty of a police officer to do that, so it will always be spent. But can we find a way not to spend overtime to do that and have them attending whether it's supposed to be on a day shift or similar? So there is something here. Yes, there will be expenditure required. Yes, there will need to be senior responsible officers in both organisations. I think it will be Assistant Chief Constable Mark Sutherland in Police Scotland, who is the criminal justice lead, who will take that on. I'm not sure about COPFS, but there needs to be a business case built that says we can't not do this because it's too expensive to keep doing what we're doing. Thank you.
I understand.
Yeah, so it's really just to add to that, we need to move with the times. We live digitally, we all live in our phones, that's where our lives are, whether it's your GP, you're giving blood, your hairdresser, your dentist. So, you know, the criminal justice system needs to move with the times, and I believe that that's what people would expect. We do have to keep in mind that that's not how everybody will want to be communicated with in terms of trauma-informed approach, so we need to be mindful of that too. Certainly our sense is that those in COPFS and Police Scotland want to bring about modernisation and change, and that is in keeping with what they've come along to this committee and had advised. The Crown Agent talks about transformative change in a number of digital and more efficient ways. Also, as I understand, the Chief Executive of Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service is leading a piece of work on digitisation of the criminal justice sector, which is to last for 9 to 12 months. We wrote to him in advance of publication of our inspection reports to highlight the recommendations which are also relevant for SCTS, and we're meeting with him in a few weeks' time to discuss the wider implications of what we have recommended. So we would hope that our report is timely in terms of what we're recommending and the more general movement across criminal justice in Scotland to digitisation and modernisation, and dragging into the 21st century and moving away from second-class stamps for citation.
Very grateful. Convener.
So, Sharon Dowie and then Jenny Hepburn.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to come back again on oversight and improvement. So, if you could tell us a bit more about how you monitor the implementation of recommendations made following inspections.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. As I said earlier, the way that COPFS manages implementation of our inspections currently is they identify a lead, usually one person, who will be responsible for implementation of the recommendations. Now, I might comment, and have done to COPFS, that I think that's a challenge. Having been an operational prosecutor for nearly 26 years, I think sometimes that can be a little unenviable, which is why we were delighted to hear that the lead for the inspection on the inquiry point was being ring-fenced for that work. As I said earlier, working groups have also been set up to support the implementation lead, but it would appear that COPFS is perhaps moving away from that in terms of their new structure, in terms of design for success. So it may be that how they approach implementation and governance, which is where I think our inspection reports will sit, because obviously we're their inspectorate, will sit under governance, and obviously they have a number of new recruits at senior civil service level within COPFS. So I imagine it might be a responsibility, a corporate responsibility for implementation. But in terms of what we do, is that we meet regularly and correspond regularly with implementation leads in relation to progress made against recommendations. They provide us evidence, which we have to consider. We ask that they submit that per recommendation as to where they see that they are meeting or otherwise the recommendation. And so we assess that evidence that they provide to us. I should circle back and say, as I'd mentioned earlier on, when we publish an inspection report, COPFS provides us with an action plan. That's a really important document in relation to implementation, and COPFS can give us an indication of where they are in relation to the recommendation, whether it's one of these that they need to start from scratch, or perhaps actually it's something that's already in train, perhaps give an idea of timescales. They tend to say how long they think they will take to implement an inspection report. In my, and I would say fairly limited experience, having become His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prosecution just last July, is that the intention is there, but it's not followed up by the pace that we would like to see. So, for example, in relation to domestic abuse, clearly that's not all been implemented, and that's one of the reasons that we're following up. In relation to the information provided to victims, basic information, we know already that the inspection in relation to inquiry point will not be implemented by the end of this month, which is what COPFS had previously stated. So I think there's probably work to be done there in terms of ongoing conversations and achievability. We also publish our assessment of recommendations in our annual reports. I know that HMICS have an up-to-date recommendation tracker on their website. We're quite envious of that, but we don't have the resource to be able to provide something like that. It would be great to be able to do so, not least because that would be readily accessible to the public. I know there's a lot of interest in implementation of our recommendations, and quite rightly so. So we continue to keep up the pace with COPFS in terms of implementation. As I've just said in evidence, there are a couple of recommendations which I've put time limits on in terms of recommendations being fulfilled, and we continue to work with COPFS where we see there perhaps be a need. Regrettably, the recommendations which the convener drew attention to in relation to domestic abuse did in fact see immediate effect, and that clearly hasn't happened, which is why I've decided to use timescales instead of immediacy, in the hope that that might make a difference. And essentially, we continue then to publish our assessment of recommendations until the totality is achieved, which can take years.
I was going to say, because that was one of the comments you actually said, recommendations open for several years.
Yes.
So I was going to ask about if they've done progress reports with timescales. So you've basically said that they do that. They do an action plan,
Action
they put timescales on it.
Yes.
Do you give them an indication about what timescales you expect then?
Well, they set their own timescales. They tend to say they'll meet the recommendations within a year. So we tend to adhere to that. Or if there's a particular sense of urgency, then yes, we would discuss when we would wish to see implementation achieved by. For example, the inspection we did in relation to complaints against the police took around 4 years to be fully implemented. There is in fact still one recommendation outstanding, which is in relation to our IT case management system, which is not entirely within COPFS control. But to my mind, it's about being fairly dogged in relation to making sure recommendations are implemented, or indeed having conversations which are actually, because of the time that has passed, because an inspection can only ever be a snapshot in time. With citations, we had to just stop because we could be forever going at it. Actually, perhaps things have changed. Legislation has come in which has necessitated COPFS doing something differently, or a recommendation perhaps has been superseded, or in fact in relation to diversion we learned not long before we were going to publish our annual report that COPFS in fact no longer accepted one of the recommendations. So those are important conversations to be having. So that's really how we go about it.
Yes, I was going to ask for some of the ones, because in one of the reports I've seen it was 10 that had not been achieved, 27 still in progress.
That's domestic abuse.
So there can be reasons that after discussion with them, they can say, well, actually, we don't accept that recommendation, and that will be taken off.
Yes, it's a matter for COPFS and the same in any organisation, whether they choose to accept our recommendations.
And that will be updated on a site.
Not for IPS. Not for HMICS have that facility. We don't currently have that. So we publish our action tables, is how I would describe them, in our annual reports. So they are available on our website for those who would be interested to see.
Just one of the other comments you'd said was no understanding of cost of citation process. You'd say, what would be the reason for that? Because normally any kind of business or organisation is always looking at productivity and efficiency, and what was the reason for them not having any understanding of the cost?
Well, there really wasn't a reason that we could identify. To be perfectly honest, we were surprised that it was not able to be quantified by either organisation. The closest that we got in relation to COPFS was there's a text service which is provided for witnesses at certain points if they've given a mobile telephone number, and that costs £11,000 a year. And also, as Craig has said, witness expenses take up costs for COPFS. I think it's about £1 million in relation to witness expenses, but that's all witness expenses, so that would include High Court witnesses as well, and obviously our inspections just in relation to citations. So those were the figures that they were aware of, but in terms of how much it costs to generate, for example, paper citations, because they are sent out in batches with other paper legal documentation, so for service, it's not possible to break down or to properly quantify how much it's actually costing COPFS to send out citations. So one of our recommendations is before they can move on to digital citation, that COPFS needs to be able to say how much the current process is costing them, so that there can be a proper assessment of what the actual efficiency saving will be. I mean, it's clear to us that there will be sufficiency savings, also environmental savings, because you're not sending batches of paper all over the country to different police stations and in different ways, no consistency of approach. But yes, neither organisation could quantify how much it currently costs.
And just a quick one for Craig. In your submission, you said that there's a new legislation continues to be a challenge for the police due to the financial and operational impact of introducing new processes. We've obviously passed a lot of legislation in this session. So which recent legislative changes do you believe will continue to place the most pressure on police?
Oh, really good question. Thank you. I suppose a couple that spring to mind. One is dangerous dogs, and there was newspaper reporting recently that the number of dogs being seized, the XL bully type dogs that was debated at length in this building, it's costing somewhere about £40,000 a year to house a dog that's been seized off an individual. When I went back and looked at the financial memorandum that came with the legislation, I don't think that was properly covered. I suspect it wasn't really understood at that point, partly because the length of period for holding a dog was not really understood of what that was going to be before a dog can either be returned to its owner if it was a safe and proper way to do that, or to be destroyed if that was the appropriate outcome. So looking at that, massive costs. Looking at the PECS bill, and I know this committee has looked at length at the financial memorandum and questioned the initial memorandum as whether it was accurate or not. We're not yet into the new way of doing business, but we will be very shortly. And there is an expectation that a whole number of costs will come into play on that, including legally qualified chairs for senior officer conduct, including the new way of doing police appeals tribunals, and so on and so forth. So the bit for me is about how do Police Scotland and the SPA become more effective at understanding the policy memorandum in the first instance, and then trying to quantify what that would look like in terms of either a change of process, a change of procedure, training. And I do recognise that Ms Regan's recent bill around prostitution, there was a lot of very good work done on that in terms of trying to understand the impact. But I think this is an emerging area of threat and risk to Police Scotland in terms of budgets, and something they need to be very much more aware of, and I know they are, but it's an emerging field.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jamie Hepburn and Rona McKine. If I can just ask for fairly succinct responses, because we're just a wee bit over time.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of areas I want to explore. This wasn't one of them, but I'm now going to follow up on something that you just said. Can you tell us what figure did you provide there for holding a seized dog?
So a seized dog, I read it in a Sunday paper recently. I think it was in excess of £40,000.
That's what I thought you said, 40,000.
Yeah.
Per dog?
Per dog, yeah. Now, I can go back.
I don't think that figure's plausible. We might need to explore that separately.
It's, well, my...
What the hell are we feeding them?
Oh, it must be gold-plated or something. My previous experience in Lincolnshire, when we were seizing dogs from hare coursers, we were paying £500 per week per dog.
Right,
now,
well, okay. Look, it's not an area I wanted to explore in detail. I think it might be something we need to look at, and as one of them is another way of reducing the pressure on the public purse. That seems an extraordinary figure. So the area I really wanted to explore is primarily with, well, actually there's two. There's one I want to explore with you, Craig, but the first one is primarily in relation to your area of responsibility, Deb, and it kind of picks up on the points that Sharon Dow's explored around the recommendations that you make to the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, and they're not required to implement them, I think you said. Now, we heard the same from Robert Scott in terms of his responsibilities for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he seemed to indicate that kind of worked well. I got a sense from you that you didn't think it worked quite as well in your instance. Is that correct?
It's not necessarily that it doesn't work well, but it means that we're obviously toothless in terms of compelling COPFS to implement recommendations, which we believe would make a difference to the efficiency of the way that COPFS operates, and ultimately then that would make improvements for the public and stakeholders. So I guess there's probably a little element of personal frustration in and around that, because I see my role in the Inspectorate as improvement of COPFS, and that's why we take great care in the way in which we go about our evidence-based inspections and how we frame our recommendations. So that's something I've been very mindful of in this recent inspection topic, is to try, insofar as is practicable, to make the recommendations workable.
Okay.
Some will take longer than others, of course.
Are they at least, do they have a statutory responsibility to respond to the recommendations?
Well, they always do in any event. So really,
That's not a statutory responsibility.
No, so they have a statutory responsibility to provide us with information about any inspection topic that we decide to embark upon. So arguably, that could incorporate provision of an action plan, but it's not formalised in legislation.
Should it be?
I don't think it needs to be, because we don't see a lag in COPFS providing that information, and we have a good, strong working relationship with COPFS. So it's not the provision of the action plan that we have difficulty with. It's the length of time that it takes for recommendations that we believe could, as I say, make a significant difference to COPFS strategic aims and objectives and the wider criminal justice system, pausing, faltering and not being implemented in the way that we would always like to see.
And I may have picked this up incorrectly, so forgive me if I haven't, but I think Sharon pursued this with you in terms of sort of line of sight of this for the wider public.
Yes.
Did you say that you don't publish that? That's not made publicly?
Oh, no, we do
available?
publish it. We publish it in our annual report.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe just pick that up.
Yeah, so the difference between us, and perhaps I've caused the confusion, is that Craig's Inspectorate has the information, like a live document on their website.
That's what I was...
Yeah, they have that. We don't have that, so we publish that annually. It's very important to me to be accountable and to set out where COPFS is in relation to implementation of recommendations. You know, the public and others across the wider criminal justice system are entitled to know that.
Is the difference between the organisations, again, is it a statutory thing, or is it just the resource
It's just resource.
Okay.
We would love to be able to. We'd love to be able to do that, but we just don't have the resource to do it.
Again, that's useful to understand. I'm sorry, Craig, just very quickly, can you explain to us the equivalent powers when you make recommendations to the to Police Scotland? Are they obliged to implement them?
They're obliged to take account of them,
okay,
which is slightly different. And much like Deborah, we are not able to force them to do it. But what we do is we're quite public in how we make our recommendations. We do all sorts of media, social media, talk about the issues, which puts it in the public's eye that we're trying to make improvements. We also have, as Deborah's mentioned, a tracker. It's on our website, so people can go in and search either on thematic issues or on dates or whatever else. And the Scottish Police Authority are very good through their Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee of holding Police Scotland to account in terms of the recommendations they've got outstanding. Not just from ourselves, but from, I know Brian Plastow's behind me, but from Brian and other organisations like him and bodies that look at covert policing and stuff like that. Okay. So they are a very scrutinised organisation and have a very slick machine that responds to the scrutiny and the recommendations made.
No, it's interesting. There might be something our Success Committee wants to look at in terms of if there should be some wider sort of coherence or equivalent power. It may not be necessary. I'm just proffering it as something we want to do.
Be good to look at.
Yeah. Okay. And just sorry, Craig, one final area for you, and it picks up on something that we'll be discussing later, and it's the regulations around vetting. Now, I'm not going to ask you to set out, you've been very clear in your letter that you support them. Yeah. I don't think it would be equitable to invite you to set out why you support them, because no one else has that opportunity. So it really does relate more to your inspection function, and to understand if this would be an area that you would be empowered to look at, not on an individual case-by-case basis, but maybe the number of people who might be dismissed, the number of people who might be suspended, the number of officers who are demoted, the number of instances where it's gone to the assessor and they have overturned whatever the decision may be. Is that something you will be able to look at and to report on, and if there's a pattern emerges, make recommendations around?
Absolutely. And we reported on vetting 2.5 years ago, and many of the recommendations that we made at that point will be signed off in reality once the vetting regulations are put into effect. What we would want to do is to go back and look at probably a year, 18 months, 2 years from now, how they've been used. Because we know there is a big risk with people who cannot sustain their vetting for various different reasons sitting within the organisation. Now, I'm not going to get on my soapbox because I could talk about this all day, but the way that we would do that is we have that same power that Deborah has, is to request information from Police Scotland. So we would look to see how they are progressing and get some form of performance report on how they are using the vetting regulations. If we see that we have concerns on that, then we would consider doing a sort of follow-up inspection at some point.
I think that's really useful to know that be part of the process of the implementation of the regulations. Thank you both.
Thank you. And finally, Rona Mackay.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, just to ask you, you've spoken about your recommendations being non-statutory, etc., and you've talked about the numbers of, ones that are complied with, if you like. So, of the ones that, presumably there are some that just never see the light of day, and you must have recommended them for a good reason. Mm-hmm. What happens to them? Do they just wither in the vine, or do you actually ask, well, did they give you an explanation of why they're not going to be able to implement them?
So I would hope, certainly while I'm Chief Inspector, they won't wither on the vine. It does go back to the point I was making that, unfortunately, because of our resources, we can't go back and have follow-up inspections for every single topic, unfortunately. But certainly my predecessor, Ms Payton, whom you heard from last week, who's now the Commissioner for PERC, had introduced this framework whereby COPFS provides an action plan. Mm. And that serves to keep up the momentum in a way that didn't happen previously. Mm-hmm. And it means that the implementation stays on the radar of the Crown Agent and those other senior officials.
But even communication-wise, and in the action plan, you see that something hasn't been actioned.
Yes.
So you don't need to do another inspection. You can just follow up with why is this not being actioned?
Yeah, and we do that. Yes.
Yeah, you do that. And do you get a reasonable response?
We tend to, yes, in my experience over the last 8 months. But that's something that's an ongoing dialogue between my inspectorate and COPFS, and it's a question of keeping up momentum and sometimes holding feet to the fire a little. Sure. But that's really important to me.
Good, thank you. And so you mentioned resources, etc. And presumably you think you could do with more staff and more money. I mean, is that a prospect that's going to? Is that something that you think will happen in the future?
I'm a realist, probably not. I look at the current budgets across criminal justice. I only think it's appropriate to flag to this committee what my resources are versus those of COPFS. For the avoidance of doubt, I think it's quite right that COPFS have, their budget has increased incrementally because we see how much change is faced by COPFS, and that is quite right. It's just, I think, a useful comparator. When you look at everything that's happening across criminal justice and what needs to be tackled by COPFS, of course, the Crown Agent has given evidence about that in terms of COVID stability, recovery, and also the transformative change they're making in terms of SCM, body-worn footage, DAS, DFS, and then we've got legislation, Victim Witness and Justice Reform Act, Sexual Offences Courts. There is so much happening and change being brought about. So it's actually a really quite exciting time, I think, for criminal justice. But we would like to be able to get in there and do more.
So you just reminded me of a question that I'd forgotten about. I was going to ask you, do you have any oversight into the planning of the Sexual Offences Court, or do you monitor what's going on there?
No. So obviously Suzanne Tanner did a review of sexual offences, and that has been published. So just in terms of inspection activity, we don't tend to inspect something that COPFS has done itself, because we want to be able to add value and do something different. So no, we don't have oversight, but we watch it with interest, because it's the sort of thing, lots and lots of things, things like sexual offences, the Sexual Offences Court, disclosure in terms of the daily case. There is so much sloshing around that COPFS has to deal with that I would love to be able to get in and about. But at best, we can do our annual report and one inspection report, whether that's collaboratively with another inspectorate or not, per year. That's our limitation to meet our statutory function at the moment.
Thank you. And just finally, I'm sure I'm not alone in being astonished to find out citations are still being handed out, sent out second post and all the rest of it. And so I'm really interested in the digitisation and actually, coming into the 21st century with it. Because a long time ago, almost 10 years ago, this committee did an inquiry into COPFS, and the overriding issue that came out was communication or lack of, with people, and it just seems to be a real snail's pace that this is starting to happen. Do you have any idea, and sorry if I missed this from an earlier conversation, about the timescale of when they're going to start sending out emails and stop using post and things like that?
I don't have an idea of timescales. I know it is competent in law to cite witnesses by email. I know that there's legislation to come in this year, which if witnesses express a willingness to be communicated with electronically, then that can happen. I think it could be massive in terms of the difference it makes to people, but I don't know, in all honesty, what the timescales for that would be.
Is that something you keep an eye on in terms of...
Oh yes, absolutely, but it'll be part of the implementation of our inspections, our citations inspection, is because of the key recommendations that we've made. Obviously, one of the key recommendations is that witnesses should be cited by email or other electronic means. So, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Apologies, Pauline McNeill.
Just to clarify, on the proposals for citation by, did you say that if the participant was willing to receive it, yes, you're not going to enforce it on everyone?
No. So this is a recent piece of legislation. So it's the criminal. I'm reading because I want to get the title correct. The Criminal Justice Modernisation and Abusive Behaviour Review Scotland Act 2025. Yeah. Is the piece of legislation that if a witness indicates willingness to be cited electronically, then that can happen. There are all sorts of considerations there, which the committee will be aware of in terms of trauma-informed approach and choice being one of the fundamentals in relation to that. But it is possible and competent to be cited electronically.
Thank you. I think that's the right way it should be. I think most people probably would opt for it, but some people would probably just prefer to have the paper. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And we need to think about digital poverty and things like that too.
You know how easy it is to delete an email? What I do. Anyway, just lastly, I just wanted to ask Craig Naylor at the HMICS about the mental health stuff that you raised. You were first to raise it with the committee, and I think credit is due to you and your organisation for bringing it to our attention, because there has been considerable focus on this now. This is now the biggest reason why we've got police officers tied up, not court duty. I don't know if you had a chance to hear the evidence that was presented to the committee from NHS and the chief psychiatrist. If you haven't, it's maybe worth having a look at it. But my interpretation of what they're saying is that there still is a gap, and that gap is what we've been trying to fill, and I think that's disappointing. It was pointed out to the committee that the police still attend calls where people have got deep, acute emotional distress, and phrases like, well, it's a societal problem, and we all know that's true, but it shouldn't fall to the police and only the police. I just wondered if you had a view about whether enough progress had been made in relation to the report that you initially did, and maybe just invite you at some point, maybe, I'm sure you'll bring it back to a future committee, I hope you do, to maybe have a look to see what the evidence we received last, or I think it was the week before last.
Thank you. It's a subject very close to my heart because when we did the inspection, we listened to representative bodies for people with lived experience about what it meant to them for a police officer in a van, often turning up when they were at the lowest point of their life, dealing with real crisis. And the phrase that was repeated so many times was, they probably stopped me from killing myself, but they made it worse. Because being in a van was a detriment to me. Being in blue lights, sitting in the hospital handcuffed to a police officer, or handcuffed with a police officer, didn't improve my well-being. And one of the core functions of policing in Scotland is improving the well-being of individuals and communities. So leaving a police officer for 10, 12, 14 hours with someone suffering probably with some form of intoxication and mental health crisis in a A&E department is not good. I listened to that evidence that you described, Ms McNeill, with real interest, and one of the things that I am really keen to see is Police Scotland to try and look at the risk that they are facing of leaving police officers in that situation when they could, with body-worn video, with new ways of sort of triaging the thought process to a professional within the health setting, could go through, this is Jimmy. Jimmy is going through a crisis, but this is a safe place. This is a safe person to leave you with. We would rather leave you with, to get medical care and treatment than to sit with you for the next however many hours it is. And do that handover in a way that is based on the needs of the individual, trauma-informed, but also taking the risk away from policing. Because very often the issue that police officers tell us about is that error, terror, as they describe it. They describe being, they don't want to be the last person to have dealt with an individual who then goes and does something to themselves, and they end up on the end of an investigation by the PERC that comes out with some conclusion that says a terrible thing happened to an individual at their own hand or at someone else's hand because they were left by a police officer in the place of safety with other professionals. It's the police officers that are held to account, no one else. That is not a sustainable position, and we are very, very aware that the challenging demands of police officers sitting in A&Es or other sector places is not being progressed as quickly as we would like to see. So yes, we will continue to agitate for that. Yes, we will continue to support the progress made by the task force. And I know the Chief Constable has spoken about this recently at the Scottish Police Authority. She is determined to do something to change the balance on this, and it needs to happen.
Thank you very much. I presume there'll be an opportunity for you to, as you did to us, write to a future committee and make sure the issue does not...
I'm not very good at staying in my lane on these things. You know, I don't publish a report and just give recommendations to the Scottish Police Authority and to Police Scotland. I do kind of colour beyond the margins and send things to Scottish Government and to other partners where I think there is a need to. I'll continue to do that because I think that's the right thing to do to address the whole system and not just the bodies that I am legally responsible for. So I've been told off about it a few times, but I will continue to do it because I think it's the right thing to do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have run over quite significantly, but that's been a very interesting session, so thank you very much for coming along and joining us today, and we'll just have a very, very brief suspension to allow a changeover of our panel. Thank you. Very much indeed, members. So I'm very happy to welcome our next panel. So welcome to Dr Brian Plasto, Biometrics Commissioner, and Karen McBride, Subject Matter Expert at the Scottish Biometrics Commission. So I refer members to paper 1, and I intend to allow about 40 minutes for this session. So can I invite Brian to make some opening remarks?
Thanks, Convener. And if I can start, as I always do, by saying it's a pleasure to appear before the Criminal Justice Committee, and obviously for the last time in this session of Parliament. As you mentioned, I'm joined today by Karen McBride. In the real world, Karen is a senior fingerprint examiner with the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services, but she's seconded to my office until September 27 to help me with a couple of important reviews, one of which was laid in Parliament yesterday. If I can just go on public record by, I suppose, recording my appreciation to the committee, both members, current and past, for the fantastic support that my function's had over the last 5 years, and also to say well done on getting through a truly significant programme of work, which is particularly legislative heavy. Members have already had the opportunity to see the written submission, so if I can maybe just pull out a couple of highlights from a few highlights. So the first thing is obviously just to remind committee members that the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner function has been in existence now for about 5 years. It's a low-cost function that works extensively in partnership, and we maintain oversight of biometric data used by 3 policing bodies, so Police Scotland, SPA and the PIRC. In the last probably 3 years, we've laid 7 different reports in Parliament. 6 of these have been thematic assurance reviews, including the one on fingerprints that was laid yesterday. And we've also done a joint review on the laws of retention with Scottish Government. And sort of collectively over the period, we've made about 34 recommendations, mostly to Police Scotland for improvement. We also maintain a statutory code of practice in Scotland, so the legislation that we operate under is backed up by powers of enforcement. And later in the summer, the first report that I will lay in the next session of Parliament will be an outcomes report, which looks back at the previous 4-year strategic plan and provides some analysis to the Parliament on what all of this means in terms of better outcomes for the public, for data subjects and for policing as well. As mentioned, yesterday I laid a report in Parliament on fingerprints. This is the first time that fingerprints have been looked at in Scotland since the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry was published in 2011. Members will remember that the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry related to the misidentification of fingerprints in a murder in Scotland from 1997, and the inquiry led by Sir Anthony Campbell explored the reasons why that had happened and made 86 recommendations for improvement. And significantly, the cost of the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry was £4.8 million. So I just use that as an example of what can happen when forensics go wrong. The good news from the fingerprints report laid yesterday is that all of the recommendations made in the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry have been successfully discharged by the SPA Forensic Services. And as I highlight in the report, in my view, the SPA Forensic Services provide a world-leading forensic service to the criminal justice system in Scotland. However, as highlighted in the report, some of that good work's actually been undermined by Police Scotland custody staff who are failing to fingerprint thousands of people arrested each year when their own policy dictates that they should. And that obviously points to weaknesses in leadership and governance within Police Scotland's custody division. So I'm sure that the force will follow those recommendations up with some urgency. I suppose the last thing to touch on is there are some challenges ahead in the next session of Parliament. Perhaps unusually, I'm not coming to the committee saying that I need more money or more resources. I don't. But, you know, there are a couple of things on the horizon that may occupy the attention of the committee in the next session of Parliament. One of those being live facial recognition. So Police Scotland, as members will know, and the Scottish Police Authority are currently considering should they adopt live facial recognition in future. And this is against the context of the Home Office providing funding for live facial recognition for every police force in England and Wales, including UK-wide policing bodies that operate in Scotland, for example, British Transport Police, who already have live facial recognition. And then, I suppose the other question for me is, for the next Parliament to consider is, does it really make sense to restrict the functions of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner to 3 policing bodies in Scotland when biometric data is shared extensively throughout the entire criminal justice ecosystem, including in prisons? And is there an opportunity to do something a bit smarter in that space? So I'm going to stop there, Convener, and yeah, we're very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to open up straight to members, just in the spirit of time. So I'm going to bring in Liam Kipp.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. And I'll go straight to the fingerprint assurance review. Just to reflect some of the remarks you've made there, Dr. Plasto. So the Scottish forensic capability is world leading. It's clearly important we start with that. But you found that the police service only takes the prints of those charged, which is different from other parts of the United Kingdom. You said in your report that this could have significant consequences and might miss up to 12,000 prints in any given year. So can you explain to the committee, why is this happening and what needs to change, and will it?
Yeah, so the reason it's happening, it's an interesting set of circumstances. The long-standing position in Scotland has always been, if you are arrested by the police, you will have your fingerprints taken, you will have your photograph taken, and since the mid to late 1980s, you'll also have DNA taken. And that used to apply in Scotland, regardless of whether you were arrested or whether you were detained. And then round about 2016 was a legislative change, and arrested people either became arrested as officially accused people or are arrested as not officially accused people. And for reasons known probably only to Police Scotland took a decision at that time that they would only fingerprint officially accused people. That never used to happen in Scotland. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the UK. It doesn't make any sense because the law, the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act, allows you to take biometric data from anybody who's been arrested. It makes sense to do so because, firstly, when you put someone who's been arrested onto the fingerprint machine, I'll just call it that, it's like a photocopier basically, within 20 seconds, if that person has been arrested anywhere in the UK before, within 20 seconds it will be able to confirm their identity, or it might say to you, see that guy that you put in cell number 1 that says he's Brian Plasto? He's not. So that's the first part. The second part is, if you don't take fingerprints from people that you have lawfully arrested, you cannot compare their fingerprints to prints lifted from unsolved crime scenes in the UK. And that obviously is now and in the future. So the second part, Liam, we've made a recommendation that Police Scotland should consider a take-all policy. In other words, they should go back to doing what used to happen in Scotland. That's a decision for Police Scotland. I'm sure they will. I'm probably quite confident that they will decide to do that.
Thank you. And on a related matter, which you found in your report, which is concerning, you highlighted bulk deletions, or an unauthorised practice, I think you might have called it, of bulk deletions when machines are rebooted. which, you said, understandably, this could have a significant impact on victims and potentially the accused. You made recommendations. I think you made 10 recommendations in your report, but you made recommendations specifically around this practice. Can you tell the committee what are they directly related to this practice? And acknowledging that your report was only published yesterday, do you get any indication of whether those recommendations will be taken on board and acted upon?
Yeah, if I can answer the second part of that question first, which is, I haven't yet experienced an instance where a recommendation that I've made to Police Scotland or the SP has not been accepted and has not been progressed, some to completion, some that are still in progress. The issue there that we tap into is we mentioned in the report that when there's certain mandatory information you must put into the fingerprint machine when you take someone's fingerprints. And as we mentioned in the report, that data then gets transmitted to the SPA Forensic Services. And the SPA Forensic Services are having to return 24% of all submissions, or they were at the time of our fieldwork, because of missing information, you know, maybe a missing date of birth, a wrong date of birth, etc., etc. All of that creates churn in the system. When we visited a custody centre in a city in Scotland, at the time of our visit, there were 3 prisoners in custody, three arrested people, but there were 202 live cases on the machine. In other words, cases which have incomplete or missing information. And what we think is happening is that there's an upper threshold on the machines. They can maybe only hold 1,300, 1,500 open cases. And what we think has happened is sometimes when that threshold has been breached, the machine then hangs and it isn't available for people to use. And so it would appear that sometimes the machine has effectively been turned on and back off again, and that has resulted in the deletion of data. Now, will be an opportunity to bring Karen in, I'm sure, but you know, Karen's seen the other side of that, where as a senior fingerprint examiner, she's received a request from the Procurator Fiscal to go and look at a set of prints, the arrest prints, only to go in and find that they're not there because they've been deleted. So, you know, that practice of deleting data is not authorised Police Scotland practice. That's the substantive point. So the recommendation that we've made, we have asked for the ability to delete records, because there are legitimate reasons where you might want to delete a record, is restricted to supervisory staff. At the moment, anybody who's a trained live scan operator can do that. So that's the issue. The recommendation will be accepted. The recommendation will be progressed. No doubt about that whatsoever.
I understand. Thank you. Convener.
Pauline McNeill, followed by Sharon Dowie.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, your key highlight in your report was well trailed in the press. I think it was really useful. I think people were quite shocked, to be honest, that this wasn't happening. Do you not think it should have occurred to somebody in Police Scotland that, from what you're saying, it's quite detrimental procedure not to be in place when it comes to solving crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we were, or sorry, I can't speak for Karen. I was as shocked as you were, Pauline, to see the level of missed fingerprint opportunities. You know, I mean, upwards of 12,000 in a year is it's just not acceptable, and it needs to change. So, yes, that was not completely unknown to Police Scotland. They knew about the problem, so that's why I said in my opening remarks, you know, that this is an issue of leadership and it's an issue of governance. So, Police Scotland does have a biometrics oversight board chaired by an assistant chief constable. They also have a head of biometrics. But the problem is that the biometrics span the portfolios of every single assistant chief constable in Scotland. And in this case, in the case of fingerprints, the problems, if you want to call them that, are lying fairly and squarely within the Criminal Justice Services Division. So it's Criminal Justice Services Division who need to put their house in order yeah, just make sure that this situation improves and improves quickly.
Thank you very much. Karen, I wanted to ask you about the use of fingerprints these days in court. I don't know when it was, but I did actually chair the parliamentary inquiry into the Shirley McKee case, which kind of cast, let's say, some question marks over the use of fingerprints following that case, which was quite a long time ago. But can you tell the committee how widely used are fingerprints now compared to DNA, or what's the balance?
The fingerprints actually can be used alongside. They don't always provide the same outcome. So the fingerprints can sit completely separately from DNA. So when cases come in, it might be that the fingerprints are more pertinent because they're specifically related to a certain item or like drugs packaging or something where the fingerprints have a different type of relevance. So a DNA hit might provide the court with one amount of information, whereas the fingerprints could provide something else. And that's where, to just connect back with what Brian was saying, there are times if fingerprints haven't then had a charge set taken, then we wouldn't be able to prepare a report for court, even though there had been an identification for that person on a legally held set of prints on the system. So I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding as well that if someone has fingerprints held, that they don't need to then go and take any more fingerprints. Whereas currently, for producing court reports, you do have to have a charged set of prints so as not to disclose any previous convictions. In terms of how many, I don't have a statistic of how many DNA reports compared to fingerprint reports. There are a regular occurrence in the fingerprint unit to be requested court reports. They sometimes come in with a standard forensic instruction where we're instructed to compare a named person who has been charged. Other times it would be a search of seen a crime marks through the database, which then hits on someone, and then they will go and detain that person, and if they decide to charge them, then we would be asked to prepare a court report. And we don't give evidence all the time. A lot of the time our evidence is accepted. However, we do produce many court reports, joint reports, with detailed findings of the outcomes of all the marks in the case and whether they were identified or compared negative, whatever.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Sharon Dowie.
In your submission, you've got that the Scottish Government has no vision for where Police Scotland should be with biometric data and technologies because there's no long-term strategy in place. And you've also said that there's a potential need to expand the Commissioner's remit to create a public safety camera code of practice for Scotland due to lack of coherent strategy to monitor public surveillance systems. So does Scotland require a more comprehensive national biometric strategy?
Yeah, thanks for it. Because my opinion is yes. So, you know, in my submission, I kind of illustrate the point about in England and Wales, the Home Office has a biometric strategy, and they support that strategy with significant funding. So, for example, upgrading the UK DNA database, upgrading the UK fingerprint database, updating the UK custody image database with a strategic facial matcher capability. The Home Office also funds the Police Digital Service, which looks at the whole digitisation piece. They are also have announced funding for a new Police National AI Centre, and you know, whether you agree with it or not, they have provided funding for an additional 50 live facial recognition vans to make that capability available to every police force in England and Wales. So if you look at Scotland, Scotland doesn't have a government-led biometric strategy. Scotland has a strategy on public space safety cameras that's so old that it's still known as a CCTV strategy. So I just think there's an opportunity for the government to set out or the next government to set out what they do want to do in this space, what they don't want to do in this space, and there are opportunities to do more with this function, including, I just think it would be a really good idea to have a public safety camera code of practice for Scotland, given the inexorable rise of artificial intelligence and the application of that to public space safety cameras.
Is that something that we could work with the Home Office on, so that we've got a system that works for the whole of the UK? I'm just thinking, because obviously crime doesn't have any borders, so is that something that we should work on, or do we need our own Scottish system?
My experience is Scotland working with the UK on certain things can be very difficult. So a good example is in 2021, when I took up this role, the civil service team were trying to pursue a Section 104 order under the Scotland Act to bring National Crime Agency, British Transport Police, Ministry of Defence, Police in relation to their Scottish operations under my jurisdiction, or rather the jurisdiction of the Code of Practice. I invested a lot of time and energy speaking to the chief officer teams of those UK-wide bodies. They were all agreeable, but then here we are in 2026 and it's just never happened. And that's did not happen with the last UK government, and it hasn't got any traction with the current UK government. So it's not a party political issue, it's just an issue of sometimes Scotland and the UK see things differently, I think.
Would it be beneficial if we worked together? I'm just thinking...
Yes, it would be beneficial.
For the benefit of
yes,
everybody.
because, look, I know I've probably bored the committee with this statement before, but it doesn't matter if you're arrested in the Shetland Islands or the Scilly Isles, your data, you know, whether it be fingerprints, DNA or your image, ends up in the same UK databases. So, yes, absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
It's beneficial if you get a system that everybody can get access to, so the information crosses borders. Right, okay, thank you.
Okay. I wonder if I can just pick up on a point that you raised in your opening statement, Brian, and that was with regard to extending your remit to the wider justice system, and that seems to make sense given the use of biometric data beyond just Police Scotland. And you spoke about prisons in particular, and the rationale for including prisons is because in your submission you set out because biometric data are acquired from prisoners without consent, including those on remand under domestic legislation, devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And one interesting point that you also include is with regard to the positive use of biometric data in terms of supporting things like easing the prison population. So I wonder, I was very interested in that proposal. I'm just wondering if you can maybe set out a wee bit more about that.
Yeah, so on the broader point, firstly, about prisons was that, you know, I think originally when this function was created, when the bill originally went through the Parliament, I think the original thinking was, you know, to restrict the functions to Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority and the Park, basically because in one way or another, they all deal with data that's been taken from people without their consent, either because they've been arrested or because they've been a victim of crime. But if you extend that rationale, well, you think, well, you know, biometric data gets taken from people in prisons under devolved Scottish powers, under legislation set by this Parliament. So it's an extension of the same logic. The preventative part that I reference in my submission is something which is known as e-carceration technologies that are increasingly being used around the world to keep people out of prisons or to manage offenders in the community. So, you know, members will be aware of, you know, the sort of old-fashioned technology, the ankle tags, but there's far more sophisticated technology now where, you know, people who have offended can be kept out of prison, who can be set a requirement to biometrically log on to their smartphone you know, through their fingerprint or voice, face recognition. There are also skin monitoring devices, you know, so people who maybe have an offending history connected with alcohol abuse or drug abuse, where there are biometric wearables which can send, you know, every 30 minutes a reading to the monitoring centre to make sure that people are complying with their conditions. So, you know, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that biometrics can be a real force for good. It can help to keep people out of prisons in a controlled way at a time when, you know, the prisons, not just in Scotland but across the UK, are at capacity. You know, so that's the context. But of course, you know, the bit about all of that is that if you're not at the table because prisons are not part of your remit, then you're not available to give that kind of advice and suggestion.
So is that something then that you'll perhaps include in your outcomes report that you mentioned that you'll be laying later on this year?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Kina. There's a two-part thing here. One is that the Scottish Government are currently doing a statutory review of our functions. So built into the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act was a requirement for Scottish Government no later than 1 year after the expiry of the first strategic plan, in other words, by late November of this year, the Government have to lay a report in Parliament setting out the Government view on whether the Commissioner's powers or functions should be increased, reduced, etc., etc. So that's a Government responsibility, and I've fed my views on all of that to the Government team that are doing that. Quite separately, as I mentioned, we're going to lay an outcomes report in Parliament. We hope to do that before the summer recess, which specifically looks back at the first strategic plan, so the 4 years from 2021 up till the 30th of November 2025, and to look back at all of our activity around the code of practice, around compliance assessments on the code, around these 6 different it'll be 5 thematic assurance reviews because the fingerprints one is in the current plan, and our joint work with Scottish Government, and to include some qualitative and quantitative data to highlight to the Parliament what does all this mean and what outcomes has that achieved in terms of either better outcomes for data subjects, better outcomes for policing, and in terms of public confidence. And on that last point, it's just worth saying that in 2021 we ran a public attitude survey. It was done for us by ScotSen. We repeated that in 2025. That one was done by the DIFLI partnership as part of the Scottish Police Authority annual public confidence in policing survey, and we're doing it again. In fact, it's been done already for 2026. We've not had the results yet, but we should get these in the next 2 weeks. So all of that will be wrapped up into that outcomes report, and we will again, as I will keep doing, I'll reiterate where I see further opportunities in this space.
Okay, thank you. And just finally from me, again in your submission, you make reference to, I suppose, work underway within Police Scotland with regard to the rollout of live facial recognition. And I think you say that Scotland may be, or according to the chair of the SPA Policing Performance Committee, Scotland may be 18 to 24 months away from a business case on live facial recognition being presented to the authority. Just interested in your views on that, and perhaps what your role will be within the work ongoing to develop the capability in live facial recognition.
So, I suppose the first thing to say is that, and this probably taps into a question that Pauline asked of Karen earlier on, which is DNA and fingerprints helps to solve about 1 in every 200 crimes in Scotland. I get quite nervous when I hear chief officers in the UK saying things like facial recognition is going to revolutionise policing. It's not, and we know that because the Metropolitan Police, when they have deployed live facial recognition, after doing so for a year and a half, they announced that they had made 1,000 arrests through live facial recognition deployments. But as part of that announcement, they explained that to achieve those 1,000 arrests, they had to scan 1.9 million faces. So, you know, that tells you that to achieve a single arrest, you need to scan 1,900 faces. So, you know, whilst it is a valuable policing tool in particular circumstances, it isn't as valuable a policing tool as DNA and fingerprints. So you can understand why Police Scotland and the SP are looking at this, because there's a national rollout in the rest of the UK. My position on live facial recognition is that I think it could add value to policing in a limited and specific set of circumstances. But the difficulty for Police Scotland will be, if they decide to do this, will be how to do it in a way that complies with the Scottish Code of Practice. Because if they were to deploy it in a set of circumstances where the same objective could have been met through conventional policing techniques, then that would not meet the high bar of the Scottish Code of Practice. So that's a clumsy way of me saying to you that it is not by accident that Police Scotland, or that Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom that currently doesn't have live facial recognition. Part of the reason we don't have it yet is because we have a statutory code of practice in Scotland which sets quite a high bar around how biometrics may be used. And significantly, my opposite number in England and Wales, the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner, his statutory powers under the Protection of Freedom Act 2012 only relate to DNA and fingerprints. He has no locus in how the police use facial technologies, and that helps you to understand why there's been some, particularly in the early days, some unregulated experimentation in this space. So, yeah, I'm not totally opposed to the concept, but it would depend on under what circumstances Police Scotland would propose to use it.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of members wanting to come in. I will have to ask you to be very, very brief because we've still got some agenda items to cover. So Jamie, Hepburn, then Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I will be brief because this would require a substantial conversation, and it is on the issue of live facial recognition. I mean, it does, I suppose, the opening question, ask it all together, would be, do you recognise it does raise some ethical questions, ethical considerations? You know, you'd be talking about an adjunct of the state with powers of arrest, scanning, I think you said Metropolitan Police scanned 1.9 million faces. There are obviously issues involved. You did use the term that, you know, there should be a limited and specific set of circumstances. This could be, it would just be useful just to get some insight as to what you mean by that. And do you think, does the Statute Code of Practice cover the sort of specific legal framework that would be required, or do you think it would be incumbent on Parliament? Clearly Parliament can take an interest in whatever it wants to in terms of reviewing matters, but do you think Parliament would have to consider whether this required further considerations in terms of a legal framework?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It's probably useful to start by acknowledging that obviously this is a highly controversial policing tool that raises a number of ethical considerations. It's probably worth pointing out at the same time, you can't walk into a major supermarket in Scotland and use the self-checkout without your face being scanned. And
although you can choose not to go into that supermarket.
Exactly. And that's the point I was about to make. So the existence of a legal framework in Scotland around biometrics relates to either you've had your biometric data taken by the police because you've been arrested, or you've had it taken by the police because you've been a victim of crime, for example. But live facial recognition is something completely different, isn't it? So it's an entirely different use. Where I think it could be useful is as part of a strategic policing response to violence against women and girls. I think if other circumstances, county lines, drug dealing would be one. And the other one that I always like to sort of say to people is, you know, if we were ever to experience an event, something like the Manchester Arena bombing, in circumstances where there was advance intelligence about a known individual attending an event in crowded public space or private space, and Police Scotland were not able to prevent that from happening because they had been denied access to a particular technology that could have prevented it from happening, then the Parliament would rightly ask questions of Police Scotland about, well, why did you not use that technology? It's there, you know. So it is a difficult one. It's one that raises lots of ethical considerations. On legislation, I think there are two options here. One is the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act, the sections relative to the Code of Practice, state that the Commissioner, in the preparation of a Code of Practice, can create provisions for different purposes. So, in other words, the current Code of Practice, which we intend amending later this year, and I should say that when we amend the Code of Practice, it has to come back through the ministerial and the parliamentary route, so that it's exposed to the full scrutiny of Parliament. Now, we are proposing to amend it at the moment to update some UK legislative changes around new, change from Data Protection Act to Data Use and Access Act, etc. But there is a potential opportunity to include either an appendix or a specific provision in the code that would set out the criteria or suggested criteria under which this sort of technology could be used in future, and then to expose that to ministerial and parliamentary debate. So that's one route.
You say debate, though. Would it have to be agreed?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it has to be.
Do you know the process? Is it?
Yes. So
sorry, you will know the process.
Yeah,
what is the process?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you could maybe write to us just to set that out.
Absolutely.
I'm just very conscious of the time. I'm really sorry to interject. I never like to do that. But if I can just make that request in order that... Sorry, apologies, Jamie Hepburn. And I'll very quickly bring in Katie Clark.
Again, I was going to raise the issues about facial recognition, and it may well be that the response could be made in writing as part. But the point, Sheila, I was going to make was the concerns and the controversy round about facial recognition, particularly in relation to racial bias and racial discrimination, but also misidentification. We know that already there's extensive use of drones, for example, at protests now in Scotland. So it would be helpful, perhaps in writing, to get a response that addresses some of these issues, because I have absolutely no doubt that you're aware of some of the concerns and the international controversy around about some of this technology. So perhaps something in writing might be helpful.
Yeah, very happy to do that. And just one very brief point on that is I'm not sure if members are aware, but Police Scotland a few months ago stopped using the retrospective facial search functionality within the UK Police National Database, and that was something they did voluntarily after the National Physical Laboratory found that the algorithm contains statistically significant demographic bias. So Police Scotland are the only police force in the UK who have discontinued the use of that software. I'll include that in my written.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and apologies for cutting things short. I never like to do that, but we're just up against the clock. So thank you very much. Really interesting session, albeit slightly curtailed. We'll have a very short suspension to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, members. So our next item of business is consideration of 3 public petitions that are currently live and which were referred to our committee during this session. So I'm grateful to all those petitioners who sent additional information to us, and I refer members to paper number 2. Now, we need to decide whether to close these petitions or keep them open for our successor in the next session. My view is that for all 3 petitions, there are reasons to keep these petitions open because they are ongoing issues that have not yet reached a conclusion, and I do not feel that it would be right to close them yet. So on that, can I perhaps open up to members and seek your views on the petition? So anybody wish to come in, or are we content to keep them open? Okay. Okay. Jamie Hepburn, you're looking...
It's just the way I look, convener. I am broadly content. I mean, it's presumably one. It's a very important issue, so I think we should keep open. I would notice there is a bit more progress on the non-fatal strangulation than maybe the other 2, but I think I do agree it should be left open.
Okay, thank you. Well, I take it then members are keen or happy, content to keep the petitions open. That's very helpful, and we'll do any follow-up accordingly. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. So our next item of business is consideration of a negative instrument, and this was held over from last week, and this is the Police Service of Scotland Vetting Regulations of 2026. Now, members will note that there was a change to the agenda for today, and that there's no longer a motion to annul for us to consider. And I'm grateful to the Scottish Government, HMICS and the Scottish Police Federation for the additional information received earlier this week. So can I ask members who wish to make any comments in relation to the negative instrument to please come in? Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd also like to put on record my thanks for what I think was necessary to have the documentation accompanying the SSI, which was considerable. I just wanted to set out why I decided not to proceed with the motion to annul. My concern had always been, and through the passage of the bill itself, the Police Conduct and Ethics Bill, I raised this issue, and the Federation raised it with us in the same ways they've raised it with us today. I want to be clear that I do support the proposals around vetting and the legislation around vetting. This is the vetting every 10 years. What I'm concerned about is the power of the Chief Constable to vet officers in between that where periodically where a reason to do so arises. And I have thought from the beginning that that is too vague. And that is the subject of the SSI, not the wider question of vetting. So things like if a police officer is financially vulnerable, personal behaviours, contrary to standards of professional behaviour, Police Scotland say they have a duty of care to the existing workforce, and I think they do, to reassure them that in ensuring public confidence in policing, they're not actually scaring police officers whose morale I don't think is the highest, that this is something that could be used willy-nilly without any framework at all. And I note that Alan Spear says dismissal following not failure to maintain your vetting would be at the most serious matter. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. But just for the record, the Federation's concerns, and they are mine too, is that if vetting clearance is withdrawn, the officer has not committed a misconduct offence, there has been no criminality, and there have been no breach of the standards of professional behaviour. Perceived vulnerability where the officer has done absolutely nothing wrong. Now, that's not to say it isn't right to have this periodic review, but the question I'd ask members to consider, I'd like to put on record for future reference, is that whether or not the process of this is fair to officers and that's who have no fault of their own. As we said during the passage of the bill, well, I certainly said, you shouldn't be bypassing the normal police conduct framework, which has the safeguards. And that is where the grey area lies to me. The Chief Constable has this power, and if someone doesn't clear their vetting, where previously it would have been, well, conduct issues would previously, or performance issues would be dealt with through a different framework. So it means that significant employment issues are determined in the operational chain of command and not through independent oversight. And that's one of the issues. Now, I did notice the Cabinet Secretary's letter, which I did find helpful. From that, I derive that the officer concerned, if that was to be the case, would be able to speak to the assessor. So there would be some scope to be able to question why vetting was not cleared. And I appreciate there is a right of dismissal that previously it wasn't there. I would have rather dealt with it before it got to the question of dismissal, but at least that it is that there. I say in conclusion, Convener, I've scanned all the arguments from Police Scotland and particularly HMIC, and I want to say this about HMIC who brought this. The only argument they've ever used is that we are out of line with England and Wales. The only argument. They haven't brought any evidence that we've got big problems with Police Scotland police officers who haven't cleared their vetting. And that disturbs me a little bit. Based on what we just heard there, Police Scotland is actually does do things differently sometimes. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't align, but to me, is that the only argument you can come up with? I'm sorry I've been so lengthy about this, but I did feel really strongly. Convener, I've concluded that I'd like to get this on the record because I think, Jamie, it's a really helpful question that you got Craig Naylor to answer is that he will review this in 18 months. Now, I hope he means review it from all sides, not just are we, are we dealing with enough police officers who shouldn't be clearing the vetting, but also has it been fair to police officers that maybe I don't want to be seen to be overused. So thank you very much for letting me put that on the record.
Okay, no,
with that, I'm content with the SSI.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I would agree with you that the supplementary information that we've received this week has been extremely helpful. So, Jamie Hepburn.
I would agree with that. I think the additional information has been useful. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with Pauline. I think replicating a set of circumstances that exist in other parts of the UK isn't reason enough alone. But I do think there are good reasons to have the ability to have intermittent vetting processes for police officers, given the powers that they hold. And the answer that we had from Craig Naylor to the question I asked gives me some further reassurance, but I have always been reassured the fact that there is an assessor involvement, there is an independent process that will look at this. So I think on balance, I remain satisfied.
Okay, thank you very much. So if members are happy, are we content that this SSI comes into force? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we were due to move on to our final agenda item, which is our legacy report. However, given the time, can I maybe seek members' agreement that we defer this item to next week when we are due to bring it back any case? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. And on that, I will close this meeting. Thank you.